I started the Appalachian Trail on March 14th, 2022, from Springer Mountain in North Georgia, which is where most northbound thru-hikers start, the southern terminus of a 2,190-mile footpath that runs from Georgia to Maine through the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. I was 29, in good physical condition, carrying a pack that weighed 32 pounds with food and water, and possessed of the particular optimism that people bring to the beginning of something they've been planning for years, and that they believe will change them in ways they can't yet articulate. The trail was going to take approximately 6 months. I'd saved for 2 years, quit my job in February, said goodbye to a life that would be waiting when I got back, and started walking north with the confidence of someone who has done the research and bought the gear and trained on the local trails, and who believes, with the faith of the prepared, that preparation is sufficient for whatever the trail produces. It isn't. The trail produces things that preparation doesn't cover, and that the guidebooks don't mention, and that the community of hikers who've completed the trail discuss only in the particular coded language of people who experience something they're not sure they should share. I learned this in Virginia, in the Jefferson National Forest, at a shelter whose name I'm not going to use, because naming it would direct people there, and because what I experienced at that shelter is something I don't want anyone else to walk into, with the casual expectation that a named shelter on a mapped trail in a national forest is a safe place to sleep. I reached the shelter around 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late April. I'd been on the trail for 6 weeks. My body adjusted to the rhythm of daily hiking, the early morning starts and the midday rest and the late afternoon push to the next shelter or campsite, the particular cadence of through hiking that becomes automatic after the first month, when the body stops protesting and starts cooperating. The shelter was a standard AT structure, the design that the trail clubs have been building for decades, a 3-sided wooden structure with a raised sleeping platform, an overhanging roof, and an open front that faces a clearing where the fire ring sits. The shelter was positioned at the edge of the clearing with the forest behind it, the open front looking south across the clearing toward the trail, the back wall facing uphill toward a slope that climbs steeply through hardwood forest to a ridge maybe 200 yards above. I dropped my pack on the platform and did what every thru-hiker does when they arrive at a shelter: checked the structure for obvious problems, located the water source, and opened the register. The register was a standard composition notebook in a gallon Ziploc bag, hung from a nail on the shelter's interior wall, the pages filled with the handwritten entries that hikers leave as part of the AT's culture of documentation. Every shelter has one. Every thru-hiker writes in them. The entries are usually mundane, weather reports and mileage logs, and the trail names and dates that constitute the social record of who was where and when. I opened the register and flipped to the most recent entries, the way I always did, checking for information about trail conditions ahead, water source status, anything useful that previous hikers had noted. The first few entries I read were normal. A day hiker, noting nice views from the ridge. A section hiker documenting 22 miles in 2 days. A through hiker complaining about the climb. Then the entries changed. The first one was dated 11 days before my arrival. The handwriting was hurried, the letters pressed hard into the paper, the writing of someone who was producing the entry quickly. It said 3 words and a sentence: "Don't sleep here. Something paces behind the shelter at night." I read it with the mild interest of someone encountering a warning that could mean anything. Hikers leave warnings about mice, about bears, about structural problems, about water sources that have gone dry. The AT registers are full of advice and warnings and the occasional dramatic entry from a hiker who had a bad night and wants to make sure everyone knows about it. The next entry was dated the following day. Different handwriting, different pen, different style. "Don't sleep here. There is something in the woods on the slope above the shelter. It walks back and forth all night. The smell is terrible." The next entry, different writer, dated 2 days later. I didn't believe the previous entries, but they were right. Something walks behind this shelter from about midnight to dawn. Bipedal, heavy, pacing. Do not stay here. I kept reading, entry after entry, spanning 11 days, 12 writers, each one in distinct handwriting that confirmed different authors, each one delivering the same message with increasing specificity and increasing urgency. Don't sleep here. Something walks behind the shelter. The pacing follows the same route. The smell arrives after midnight. You will feel watched from the uphill slope. The consistency was what held my attention. Not one hiker having a bad experience and writing a dramatic entry. 12 hikers, over 11 days, arriving independently, spending one night, and leaving entries that describe the same phenomena with the same details. The pacing, the bipedal rhythm, the smell, described variously as animal but wrong and like something dead but not dead and organic in a way I can't describe. And the feeling of being watched from the uphill direction, the slope behind the shelter where the forest climbed to the ridge. 5 of the 12 entries specifying this direction independently. I considered my options. The next shelter was 8 miles north, which at 4 in the afternoon meant a hike that would put me at the next shelter well after dark, headlamp hiking on unfamiliar trail, the kind of miles that thru hikers avoid when they have a shelter available. I could camp in the clearing in front of the shelter, but the register entries didn't specify the shelter itself as the problem. They specified the area, the forest behind the shelter, the slope, the proximity. Moving 50 feet from the shelter to a tent site in the same clearing wouldn't change my distance from whatever the entries were describing. I stayed. The decision was practical and it was stupid, and I knew it was both of those things as I made it. The rationality of choosing the available shelter, overriding the accumulated warning of 12 strangers who had slept in this same shelter and who had all independently concluded that sleeping here was a mistake. I cooked dinner as the light faded. I organized my gear on the platform. I did the evening routine that 6 weeks of thru hiking had made automatic, the water treatment and the food bag hanging, and the preparation for sleep that constitutes the end of every hiking day. The forest behind the shelter was dark by 7. The April canopy still thin enough to show the sky through the branches but thick enough to block the last light at ground level. The slope above the shelter, going black, while the clearing still held the gray remnants of dusk. I was in my sleeping bag by 8:30. The shelter was quiet. The forest produced its normal sounds, the spring chorus of frogs from the creek below, the occasional owl, the rustle of small mammals in the leaf litter. Normal, expected. The acoustic baseline of a Virginia forest in April. The sound started around 2. I was not asleep. I'd been lying on the platform in the particular state of sustained alertness that the register entries had produced, the body refusing to release into sleep because the brain had been primed by 12 warnings to expect something, and the expectation was enough to keep the nervous system at a level of vigilance that sleep couldn't override. I'd been listening to the forest for 5 hours, and the forest had been normal for 5 hours, and I was beginning to construct the comfortable conclusion that the register entries were exaggerated or fabricated, or the product of 12 hikers who'd been spooked by the same raccoon. The footsteps came from the slope behind the shelter. Heavy, rhythmic, bipedal. The alternating pattern of something walking on 2 legs through the leaf litter on the forested slope above the shelter, the steps producing the particular crunch and rustle that significant weight creates on a surface of dry leaves and fallen branches. The footsteps moved from left to right across the slope, traversing the terrain behind the shelter at a distance that I estimated at maybe 30 yards. The sound clear enough to track directionally, the pace steady, unhurried, the rhythm of something that was not exploring but traveling a route, walking a path that it had walked before. The footsteps reached the right edge of whatever route the walker was following and stopped. A pause, maybe 5 seconds. Then the footsteps returned, right to left. The same path, the same pace, the same heavy bipedal rhythm, the walker reversing direction and covering the same ground in the opposite direction. At the left edge, another pause. Then left to right again, pacing. The word the register had used was accurate and specific. Something was pacing behind the shelter, walking back and forth on the slope with the repetitive, mechanical rhythm of an animal in a cage or a sentry on a wall, covering the same ground in both directions, the route consistent, the pace unwavering. The smell arrived about 20 minutes after the pacing started. It came downhill, carried by the cool air that descends slopes at night, the thermal gradient pulling air from the ridge above toward the valley below, and carrying with it the scent of whatever was walking the slope. The smell was organic in a way that I don't have adequate vocabulary for. Not the smell of a dead animal, not the smell of a living animal, not any single biological scent that I could identify. A combination, the composite odor of something that existed in the overlap between alive and not alive, a biological presence that produced a scent signature unlike anything the forest normally contains. The smell was strong enough to register through the open front of the shelter, strong enough that I pulled my sleeping bag over my nose and breathed through the fabric, the nylon providing minimal filtration of an odor that seemed to have weight. The pacing continued. For hours, the footsteps tracking back and forth across the slope, with the relentless consistency of a metronome, the rhythm never changing, the pace never varying, the distance never adjusting. Whatever was on the slope was walking a fixed route at a fixed speed and was not going to stop. I did not sleep. I lay on the platform and I listened to the pacing and I smelled the smell and I felt, with a certainty that was physical rather than intellectual, the sensation of being watched. Not from the forest in general, but from a specific direction, the uphill slope, the area where the pacing occurred, the feeling of attention directed at the shelter from a position that was above and behind, the pressure of observation from something that could see me, even though I couldn't see it. 5 of the 12 register entries had described this feeling and had identified the same direction. I was the 13th person to lie in this shelter and feel the weight of attention from the slope above, and to know, with the particular knowledge that the body provides when the mind's rational frameworks are insufficient, that whatever was pacing on that slope was aware of the shelter and was aware of me in it, and was walking its route not despite my presence but in response to it. The pacing stopped around 5:30. The pre-dawn gray was beginning to show through the canopy, the April dawn arriving with the gradual brightening that the mountains produce when the light climbs the sky before it clears the ridges. The footsteps ceased mid-route, somewhere in the middle of a leftward traverse, the sound stopping without the deceleration of a walk ending, the silence arriving as abruptly as the walking had arrived 3.5 hours earlier. The smell faded. The feeling of being watched diminished. The forest returned to its morning sounds, birds beginning to vocalize, the frogs quieting, the particular acoustic transition that dawn produces in the Appalachian forest. I was packed and moving within 10 minutes. Not the usual morning routine of slow coffee and slow breakfast, and the leisurely start that thru-hikers allow themselves when the day is long and the pace is sustainable. I packed my gear with the efficiency of evacuation, the body performing the familiar tasks at a speed that fear had accelerated, the pack on my back and my feet on the trail before the sun had cleared the ridge. I wrote in the register before I left. I was the 13th entry. I wrote what the 12 before me had written, the same warning, the same details, the same message that I now understood was not exaggeration and not fabrication, but the honest documentation of 12 separate experiences of the same phenomenon. Don't sleep here. Something paces the slope behind the shelter from approximately 2 a.m. to dawn. Bipedal, heavy. The smell is real. The feeling of being watched is real. Don't sleep here. I quit the trail in Virginia. Not at the shelter, not on that day, but within the week. The experience on the sleeping platform converting the particular optimism that had sustained me for 6 weeks into something else. A particular awareness that the trail passes through terrain that holds things the guidebooks don't list, and that the shelters are not always the safe havens that the trail community presents them as. I quit and I went home, and I told people I'd quit because of a knee injury, which was easier than telling them I'd quit because of a shelter register and a sound on a slope and a smell that arrived at 2 in the morning and a feeling of being watched that 12 strangers had described before me. The shelter is still there. The trail still passes it. Hikers still stay in it because hikers arrive tired, and the next shelter is 8 miles away, and the register's warnings are easy to dismiss in daylight when the slope behind the shelter shows nothing but forest, and the clearing is quiet, and the platform looks like every other platform on every other shelter on the trail. But the register fills, entry by entry, hiker by hiker, the documentation accumulating in the notebook that hangs on the nail inside the shelter, the same warning repeated by the same strangers who arrived independently and who spent one night and who left in the morning with the same story. Don't sleep here. And the slope holds what it holds, and the pacing continues, and the smell arrives at 2 and departs at dawn. And whatever walks the route behind that shelter does it every night for every hiker who ignores the register and stays. And in the morning they write their entry, and they add their voice to the chorus, and they leave. And the next hiker arrives, reads the register, and decides to stay anyway. The way I did. I've been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for 9 years, accumulating the miles in week-long segments when my schedule allows, building toward a completed thru hike done in pieces, the way people do it when they can't take 5 months away from work, and when the mountains are close enough that a week at a time feels like enough. I've hiked sections in 14 states, from the rocky scrambles of Pennsylvania to the balds of Tennessee to the birch forests of New England, logging somewhere around 1,200 miles of the trail's 2,100 in segments that stitch together on the map like a line drawn in installments, the gaps between the completed sections narrowing each year as I fill in the pieces that remain. The Smokies section was one I'd been saving, not deliberately, not as a culminating experience, but because the logistics of hiking through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park require more planning than most AT sections, the permits and the mandatory shelter stays, and the bear regulations, and the particular administrative infrastructure that the Park Service imposes on a section of trail that crosses the most visited national park in the country through terrain that is among its most remote. The AT through the Smokies runs along the ridgeline that forms the Tennessee-North Carolina border, a 70-mile traverse at elevations that are mostly above 5,000 feet, the trail following the spine of the mountains through forest that is dense and old, and that in October produces the particular atmospheric conditions that the Smokies are named for, the moisture rising from the valleys and condensing at elevation to create the smoke, the clouds and the fog that wrap the ridgeline in white, and that transform the trail from a path through a forest into a path through nothing. I entered from the south in mid-October of 2021, starting at Fontana Dam and hiking northbound toward Newfound Gap, a 5-day trip that would cover approximately 40 miles of ridgeline, and that I'd planned with the meticulous attention that solo hiking in the backcountry demands, every shelter reservation confirmed, every water source identified, every mile calculated against the daylight hours that October provides, which in the Smokies at 5,000 feet are shorter than the calendar suggests, because the mountains block the sun at both ends of the day, and the effective hiking hours are compressed into a window that closes early. The first 2 days were beautiful. The ridge was clear, the October color at its peak, the views from the balds extending for miles in every direction, the layered blue ridges receding into distance with the particular visual texture that gives the Smokies their name even on clear days, the atmospheric moisture softening the far ridges into graduated shades of blue and gray that look painted rather than real. The trail was well maintained and well marked, the white blazes appearing at regular intervals on the trees that lined the path, the shelters clean and functional, the water sources running. I saw no other hikers. This was expected. October on the AT and the Smokies is between seasons. The through hikers who started in Georgia having passed through months earlier, the southbound hikers still in New England, the section hikers mostly finished for the year. The ranger at the permit station had confirmed what the empty trail showed me. I was the only hiker permitted for this section during my travel dates. The third day was fog. I woke in the shelter to a world that had been erased overnight, the forest and the mountains and the sky replaced by a uniform white that began at the shelter's open front and extended in every direction without variation or depth. The fog was dense in the way that Smokies fog is dense. Not the patchy, drifting fog of lowland weather, but the solid, immersive fog of a cloud sitting on a mountain, the moisture so thick that it deposited visible droplets on every surface. The trees dripping, the trail surface wet, my pack and my clothing developing a sheen of water within minutes of leaving the shelter. I hiked into it. The trail at this elevation was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide, running along the ridgeline through forests that pressed close on both sides, the trees appearing as dark shapes in the fog at a distance of maybe 30 feet and dissolving into the white before they could be identified as species. The trail surface was the only reliable reference, the packed earth and the rocks and the roots showing the direction of travel when the fog removed every other navigational cue. I walked by feel and by the white blazes that appeared on trees when I was close enough to see them, the blazes emerging from the fog at arm's length and confirming that I was on the trail before disappearing behind me into the white. The footsteps started about an hour into the day's hike. I heard them behind me, not the sound of my own footsteps echoing, which doesn't happen on a dirt trail in dense fog where the moisture absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. A separate set of footsteps, distinct from mine, tracking behind me at a distance that I estimated at about 30 yards, based on the volume and the slight delay between my steps and theirs. The rhythm matched mine. Step for step, the cadence synchronized, the pace identical, the footsteps falling in the same pattern that mine produced on the trail surface, the particular sound of boots on packed earth and rock, maintaining a precision of timing that eliminated the possibility of coincidence. I stopped. The footsteps stopped, not with the gradual deceleration of someone who notices they're catching up and adjusts their pace. Immediately, my last step and their last step occurring simultaneously, the silence arriving at the same instant from both positions on the trail, the synchronization maintained even in the act of stopping. I turned around. The trail behind me disappeared into the fog within 50 feet, the packed surface visible for maybe 30 yards before the white erased it, the trees on both sides fading into shapeless gray. Nothing was visible. No figure, no shape, no movement in the fog. The trail behind me looked exactly like the trail ahead of me, a narrow path dissolving into white, occupied by nothing that my eyes could find. I called out, "Hello," the standard trail greeting, the word projected into the fog with enough volume to reach whatever was walking 30 yards behind me. The sound went out and the fog absorbed it with the particular acoustic deadness of saturated air, the word traveling a short distance and then stopping, not echoing, not reflecting, just ceasing to exist as the moisture killed its energy. No response. The fog held its silence. The dripping of water from the trees was the only sound, the constant, arrhythmic patter of moisture condensing on leaves and falling to the trail and the forest floor. I resumed walking. The footsteps resumed. Same distance, same pace, same synchronization. My right foot down and their right foot down, the timing exact. The sound of two people walking the same trail at the same speed, with the precise coordination of a drill team. I tried variations. I walked faster. The footsteps accelerated. I slowed to a near stop. They slowed to a near stop. I took 3 quick steps and then paused. 3 quick steps behind me, and then silence. Every variation I introduced was matched instantaneously, the response happening in real time with no perceptible delay, the footsteps behind me responding to my changes in pace, as if they were connected to my movement by a mechanism more direct than hearing and responding, as if whatever was behind me was not reacting to my footsteps, but was producing its own footsteps from the same source that produced mine. I stopped 5 more times over the next hour. Each time the footsteps stopped with me. Each time I turned and looked and the fog showed me nothing. Each time I resumed, and the footsteps resumed, and the synchronization held with the mechanical perfection that was the most disturbing element of the experience, the absolute precision of a matching that left no room for the slight variations that a human follower would produce, the imperfect synchronization that results from one person listening to another and trying to match their pace. There were no imperfections. Every step matched, every stop synchronized. The rhythm behind me was a perfect mirror of the rhythm I produced, reflected from 30 yards back through fog that showed nothing and that refused to reveal what was producing the reflection. 4 hours. The footsteps followed me for the entire day's hike, approximately 11 miles of ridgeline trail through fog that never lifted, 4 hours of walking with something walking behind me at 30 yards, matching my pace, stopping when I stopped, maintaining the constant distance that said this was not an approach and not a pursuit, but an accompaniment, something walking with me through the fog with a patience that didn't fluctuate and an attention that didn't waver and a precision that exceeded any human capacity for sustained synchronization. I reached the shelter in the mid-afternoon, the structure appearing out of the fog with the sudden materiality of solid objects emerging from white, the stone walls and the roof and the sleeping platform showing as dark shapes that resolved into a building as I approached. I stepped onto the sleeping platform and turned around and looked at the trail behind me. Fog, the trail disappearing into white, the dripping of water, the particular silence of a cloud-wrapped ridgeline at 5,000 feet. The footsteps had stopped when I reached the shelter, not gradually, not with a final set of steps that suggested a walking organism coming to a halt. They simply weren't there anymore, the sound ceasing at the point where I stepped off the trail and onto the shelter's platform, as if the boundary of the shelter was a line that the footsteps wouldn't cross, a perimeter that whatever was following me recognized and respected. I checked the register. The previous entry was from 3 days before my arrival, a through hiker's note about the weather and the fog. No entries between that hiker and me. No one had been at this shelter or on this section of trail in the days between that entry and my arrival. The trail behind me was empty of permitted hikers for the entire length of the section I'd just walked. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the shelter and listened to the fog drip, and I thought about the footsteps and the precision of their synchronization and the distance they'd maintained, and the 4 hours of matched walking through a fog that never showed me what was behind me. The fourth day was clear. The fog lifted overnight, and the morning showed the ridge in full October color, the views extending for miles, the trail visible ahead and behind for hundreds of yards, the forest open enough to see between the trees for considerable distances on both sides. I hiked at my normal pace, and I listened, and the trail behind me produced only the sounds that a trail produces when no one is walking on it. The natural sounds of the ridge in October, the wind and the birds and the rustle of leaves falling. No footsteps. The clear day showed me what the fog had hidden, which was nothing. An empty trail behind me, the packed earth showing only my boot prints from the morning's walking, the forest on both sides holding only trees and the October light. I've hiked many more sections since. I've hiked in fog and in clear weather and in every condition the AT produces. I've never heard the footsteps again. The experience belongs to that one day, that one section of ridgeline in the Smokies, that one October afternoon in fog so dense that the world reduced to a 30-yard sphere of visibility, and the only reference points were the trail beneath my feet and the sound of something walking behind me with a precision that nothing human could sustain. I think about it when the fog comes, not with fear exactly, but with the particular awareness of someone who has been followed, and who knows they were followed, and who can't determine by what. The fog in the Smokies does something to the trail that clear weather doesn't. It isolates you. It reduces the world to the trail and the trees and the sound, and it removes the visual information that normally tells you what's around you and whether you're alone. In the fog, you walk by sound and by feel, and by the white blazes that appear at arm's length, and the world beyond your sphere of visibility is unknown and unknowable, and might contain anything. It might contain someone walking 30 yards behind you, matching your pace, stopping when you stop, following you through the fog with a precision that says it knows exactly where you are and how fast you're moving, and that it intends to maintain its distance and its rhythm for as long as you walk, and as long as the fog holds, and as long as the conditions allow whatever it is to exist in the blank white space between the trees that the clear day will erase. The fog lifts. The footsteps stop. The trail is empty, but the fog comes back. In the Smokies, the fog always comes back. And on the days when the clouds sit on the ridge and the visibility drops to 30 feet and the trail disappears behind me into white, I listen, and the trail behind me is quiet. So far, I've been a ridge runner for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for 4 summers, working a section of the trail in the Jefferson National Forest in Southwest Virginia, the stretch that runs through the mountains between Damascus and Pearisburg, about 150 miles of trail that I hike in segments, back and forth, from May through September. The job is part maintenance and part social work and part law enforcement, the particular combination of tasks that the AT requires of the people who take care of it, the daily hiking and the shelter maintenance and the interaction with the hundreds of through hikers and section hikers and day hikers who use this section of trail during the summer months. I check the shelters for damage and cleanliness. I monitor the campsites for compliance with the regulations that the Forest Service imposes on backcountry camping. I talk to hikers about leave no trace practices and bear safety and water treatment and the 100 other topics that ridge runners address in the course of a day on the trail. And I look for problems, the situations that the backcountry produces when people are far from roads and cell service, and the infrastructure that the front country provides, the injuries and the illnesses and the lost hikers, and the occasionally more serious incidents that require me to activate the emergency protocols that the Conservancy has trained me to follow. I found the tent on a Tuesday morning in mid-August of 2022, during a routine patrol of a section of trail about 18 miles south of Pearisburg. The trail in this area runs through dense hardwood forest on a ridge that undulates between 3,000 and 4,000 feet. The terrain steep on both sides of the ridge, the forest thick enough that the canopy blocks most of the sky, and the understory fills the spaces between the trunks with the particular green density that August in the southern Appalachians produces. The designated campsites along this section are small, flat areas cleared beside the trail and marked with posts, the basic infrastructure that the Forest Service provides for backcountry camping, a flat spot and sometimes a fire ring, and the understanding that hikers will carry in everything they need and carry out everything they brought. The campsite was about 2 miles south of a shelter that I'd checked the previous day. I came around a bend in the trail and saw the tent set up on the flat area beside the trail post, a solo backpacking tent in green nylon, the kind of tent that thru hikers carry, lightweight and compact and designed for one person in their gear. The tent was properly pitched, the rain fly on, and the guy lines staked, the setup showing the practiced hand of someone who had pitched this tent many times and who had done it correctly, the fly taut, the ventilation vents positioned properly, the vestibule extended and staked to create the covered space that hikers use for storing boots and gear they want to keep dry, but don't want inside the sleeping compartment. The boots were in the vestibule, a pair of trail runners, the lightweight hiking shoes that most thru hikers use now, instead of the heavy leather boots that an older generation of hikers preferred. The shoes were placed neatly side by side, toes pointing out, positioned the way you place your shoes when you take them off for the night, and set them where you'll step into them in the morning, the particular alignment of footwear that says I'm done walking for the day and I'll resume in the morning, the shoes waiting at the threshold of the tent for feet that would step into them and continue north. I noticed the leaves first. The rainfly was covered with a scattering of leaves that had fallen from the canopy above, the normal accumulation that any tent receives when it's pitched beneath trees. But the accumulation was more than one night's worth. August leaves don't fall in quantity, not the way October leaves do, but they fall in a steady trickle, the occasional leaf releasing from a branch and drifting down, and the number on the fly suggested at least 2 or 3 days of accumulation, a layer that built up gradually and that hadn't been brushed off because nobody had been there to brush it. The ground around the tent confirmed the timeline. Where the rainfly met the ground, the grass beneath was yellowed, the particular blanching that happens when vegetation is deprived of light for several days, the grass under the fly dying back from the shade in a pattern that suggested the tent had been in this position for a minimum of 3 days. The ground around the stakes showed no recent footprints, the soil undisturbed, except for the compression of the stakes themselves, the area around the tent carrying the particular look of a campsite that has been set up and abandoned. I called out, standard Ridge Runner protocol when approaching an occupied tent, the verbal announcement that identifies you and that gives the occupant time to respond before you get closer. I called twice. No response. The tent was still, the nylon walls showing no movement from inside, the vestibule undisturbed, the boots sitting in their neat parallel alignment. I opened the vestibule and looked inside the tent. The interior was organized with the efficiency of an experienced hiker, a sleeping pad, inflated and positioned on the tent floor, a sleeping bag, unzipped and laid out on the pad as if the sleeper had gotten out of it and hadn't rolled it up. A backpack, leaning against the side wall of the tent, packed, the compression straps cinched, the hip belt unbuckled, the pack in the state it would be in if the hiker had arrived at camp, set up the tent, placed the pack inside, and hadn't touched it again. Side pockets on the pack held water bottles, both full. The main compartment, which I opened with the careful attention of someone who is now conducting a search rather than a casual check, contained food. Several days' worth of the lightweight, high-calorie provisions that thru hikers carry, energy bars and dehydrated meals and trail mix, and the particular assortment of calories that a person needs to sustain the daily output of hiking 15 to 20 miles over mountain terrain. Everything was present. The tent, the sleeping system, the pack, the food, the water, the clothing that I found in a stuffed sack inside the pack, a complete set of camp clothes, the shorts and the shirt and the base layers that a hiker changes into at the end of the day when the hiking clothes are wet with sweat and the evening is cool enough to warrant dry layers. The hiking clothes were not in the tent. Whoever had been here had been wearing their hiking clothes when they left, which was normal. You put on your hiking clothes in the morning and you hike. Except the boots were in the vestibule. The hiking clothes were on the hiker, and the boots were at the tent, which meant the hiker had dressed and then left the campsite without putting on their shoes, barefoot, into a section of the Appalachian Trail where the terrain is rocky and root-covered and steep, where the trail surface is composed of the particular combination of embedded stone and exposed root and packed earth that the mountains of Southwest Virginia produce, and that is punishing, even in proper footwear. Whoever had been in this tent had stepped out of their sleeping bag, put on their hiking clothes, stepped past their boots without putting them on, and walked away from a fully equipped campsite into the forest barefoot. I checked the shelter register. The nearest shelter, 2 miles north, had a register that I'd read the previous day during my patrol. I hiked back to it and checked the entries. A thru-hiker's entry from 3 days prior, dated Saturday, mentioned camping at the site where I'd found the tent. The entry was standard, noting the mileage and the weather, and a comment about the water source near the campsite being good. The trail name in the entry was Cricket. The handwriting was neat, the entry unremarkable, the documentation of a day on the trail by a hiker who was doing what thru-hikers do, walking north, logging miles, recording their progress in the shelter registers that serve as the AT's collective diary. No entries after Crickets. No record of Cricket at any register or shelter further north. No record of Cricket at the shelters to the south that I checked on subsequent days. Hiking back along the trail, reading every register, looking for any mention of a hiker with that trail name who had continued in either direction. Cricket had camped at that site on Saturday night and had not appeared in any register in either direction since. I activated the missing hiker protocol, called the Conservancy, called the Forest Service, reported the tent and the gear and the boots and the absence of the hiker. A search was organized. Rangers from the Jefferson National Forest joined ridge runners and volunteers in a systematic search of the area around the campsite, expanding outward in grids, checking the trail in both directions, checking the off-trail terrain on both sides of the ridge, the steep, forested slopes that dropped away from the ridgeline into drainages and hollows that were dense and dark, and that received no foot traffic. 3 days of searching. 27 searchers covering terrain that expanded with each day, the search area growing as the time since Cricket's last known position increased, and the possible distance traveled on foot increased with it. Dogs were brought in on the second day, tracking dogs that worked from the scent at the tent, the sleeping bag and the clothing, providing a strong scent profile that the dogs used to search the surrounding area. The dogs found nothing. Not nothing as in they searched and didn't locate the person. Nothing as in they couldn't establish a track. The scent at the tent was strong and identifiable, but it didn't leave the tent. The dogs worked the campsite and circled and worked it again, and could not find a scent trail leading away from the tent in any direction. The hiker's scent was in the tent and on the gear and on the boots in the vestibule, and it stopped there. No trail of scent leading north on the trail. No trail leading south. No trail leading off the trail into the forest on either side. The scent existed at the campsite and nowhere else, as if the hiker had been present in the tent and had then ceased to be present without moving through any space between the tent and wherever they went. The search was suspended after a week. Cricket was entered into the missing persons database. The gear was collected and stored as evidence. The tent was taken down and the campsite returned to its empty state, the flat area beside the trail showing only the slight depression where the tent had been, and the yellowed grass where the fly had blocked the sun, and the 2 small holes where the boot prints in the vestibule had compressed the soil. I've walked past that campsite hundreds of times since. It's a normal campsite now, used by hikers who pitch their tents and sleep and pack up and continue in the morning. The routine of the trail functioning normally on a piece of ground where someone stopped functioning, and where the search that followed couldn't determine why. Cricket was never found. The missing persons case remains open. The gear is in storage at a Forest Service facility. The boots, the trail runners placed neatly in the vestibule by a hiker who intended to step back into them, were photographed and cataloged and stored with the rest of the gear. The shoes that waited at the threshold of a tent for feet that never came back to fill them. I think about the boots. I think about the neatness of their placement, side by side, toes out, the alignment of shoes set down by a person who expected to put them on in the morning and who had no reason to believe the morning would bring anything other than another day of hiking north. The boots said everything about Cricket's intention. They said, "I'm coming back." They said, "This is temporary." They said, "I'll step into these shoes and walk to the next shelter and write in the register and eat my food and drink my water and do what I've been doing every day for months." And then Cricket didn't. Stepped past the boots, walked barefoot into the forest or onto the trail, or into whatever Cricket walked into when they left the tent for the last time. No scent trail, no footprints that the searchers could find, no record at any register in either direction. Gone. From a campsite on a ridge in Southwest Virginia, barefoot, in the middle of the night or the early morning, leaving everything behind that a hiker needs to survive, and taking nothing except whatever they were wearing, and the particular intention that made them step past their boots and walk into a section of Appalachian forest that doesn't give back what it takes. The trail continues. Hikers walk past that campsite every day. They pitch their tents and set their boots in the vestibule and sleep and wake and put their boots on and walk north, and the trail does what the trail does. And somewhere in the Jefferson National Forest, on a ridge or in a hollow or in a drainage, that the searchers covered and that the dogs couldn't track, Cricket is, or was, or isn't anymore. The distinction between those options is the thing that I carry, and that the missing persons database carries, and that the boots and storage carry. The unanswered question of a hiker who stopped hiking and whose boots are still waiting for the feet that placed them so neatly in the vestibule of a tent on an August night, when everything was in order and the morning should have been ordinary. The boots wait, in a storage facility, in a box, side by side, and the campsite waits, on the ridge, in the forest, beside the trail, and somewhere, whatever answered when Cricket stepped barefoot into the dark is waiting too. Patient as boots set beside a tent, as patient as mountains. We were 4 months into a northbound through hike of the Appalachian Trail, the particular stage of the journey where the novelty has worn off and the reality has settled in, and the hikers who are still on the trail are the ones who have made peace with the discomfort and the monotony and the particular demands that walking 15 to 20 miles a day through mountain terrain imposes on a body and a mind for months at a time. There were 4 of us who'd been hiking together since Virginia, not by plan but by the natural selection that the trail performs on its hikers, the pace and the personality and the daily rhythm aligning between people who started as strangers and who became, through the shared labor of walking, the closest thing to a family that the trail produces. Myself, a woman named Beck who'd quit her law firm to hike, a retired teacher named Gordon who was the oldest of our group at 61 and who hiked with a steadiness that put the rest of us to shame, and a kid named Danny who was 22 and who had started the trail because he didn't know what else to do and who had found in the walking a purpose that the rest of his life hadn't provided. We were in North Carolina, the Nantahala National Forest section of the AT, the stretch that runs through the mountains south of the Smokies, and that in late July was at the peak of its summer density, the forest thick and green and loud with insects, the trail, a narrow corridor through vegetation that pressed close on both sides, and that produced the particular claustrophobia of hiking through a tunnel of green that blocks the sky and the sight lines, and that reduces the world to the trail's surface and the canopy above. The shelter was a standard AT structure, the 3-sided design that the trail has used since the 1930s, a wooden platform under a roof with 3 walls and an open front, the basic geometry of a building that provides a floor to sleep on and a roof to keep the rain off and nothing else. The shelter sat at the edge of a small clearing maybe 50 yards from the trail, accessed by a short side trail that led down a slight slope to the flat area where the shelter and the fire ring and the privy trail created the small infrastructure of an AT campsite. The forest surrounded the clearing on 3 sides, the trees starting maybe 20 yards from the shelter's walls, the canopy overhead leaving a gap above the clearing that showed the sky, and that in July showed the stars when the clouds allowed it. We arrived around 5 in the afternoon and set up with the efficiency of hikers who have been doing this for 4 months. The packs on the platform, the sleeping bags unrolled, the cook kits out, the bear bags hung. The routine performed without discussion, because the routine had been performed so many times that it required no discussion. We cooked dinner and ate and sat on the platform edge and talked about the trail and the miles and the weather and the things that through hikers talk about, because the trail is the world, and the world outside the trail has receded to a distance that makes it theoretical rather than real. Dark came around 9. The July dark of the southern Appalachians, arriving late and arriving warm, the temperature dropping from the 80s into the 70s and the humidity staying where it was, the air thick and still, and holding the particular nighttime density that the mountains produce when the day's heat is trapped in the valleys and the hollows and the clearings by the vegetation that surrounds them. We settled into the sleeping bags, 4 of us in a row on the platform, the shelter's open front facing the fire ring and the privy trail and the forest beyond. The particular vulnerability of sleeping in a structure with no front wall in a forest that is dark and wild, and that contains things that the daylight keeps at a distance, and that the night releases. The mice came first. Shelter mice are a constant on the AT, the small rodents that have colonized every shelter on the trail, and that emerge at night to investigate the food and the gear and the hikers who are trying to sleep. You learn to ignore them. The scrabbling and the rustling of mice in a shelter is background noise after 4 months, the acoustic baseline that you process below consciousness. And that doesn't wake you or concern you because mice are mice and they're everywhere and they're not a threat. I was awake at 1 in the morning for no reason I could identify. Not the mice, which were doing their usual thing. Not a sound from the forest. Not a dream. Not the discomfort of the sleeping platform. Just awake. The particular sudden alertness of someone whose body has detected something that the conscious mind hasn't processed. The old alarm system pulling you to wakefulness because the environment has changed in a way that requires attention. I lay on the platform and listened. The forest was producing its standard nighttime sounds, the insects and the occasional owl, and the constant low-frequency hum that a healthy summer forest generates from the accumulated biological activity of millions of organisms. The creek near the campsite was audible, the background murmur that had been present since we arrived. Everything sounded normal. Then I heard the footsteps. They came from the forest behind the shelter, from the tree line on the uphill side, maybe 20 yards from the back wall. The sound was clear in the July night. Footsteps on leaf litter, the particular crunch and rustle of something walking on the dry leaves, and the humus that covered the forest floor. The steps were bipedal, alternating left and right with the unmistakable rhythm of something walking on 2 legs, each step producing a distinct impact, the weight compressing the leaves and the soil beneath in a cadence that was steady and even and that was moving around the shelter. The footsteps tracked from behind the shelter toward the left side, moving along the tree line at a consistent distance that I estimated at 20 yards, the sound maintaining its volume as the source traveled parallel to the shelter's wall. The pace was unhurried, maybe 2 steps per second, the rhythm of a comfortable walk, the kind of pace that a person maintains when they're walking without purpose or urgency, covering ground as a function of movement rather than destination. Beck was awake. I could tell by her breathing, the change from the deep, regular pattern of sleep to the shallow, controlled pattern of someone who is awake and who is listening and who has decided not to announce their wakefulness. Gordon was awake too, his body rigid on the platform beside me, the particular tension of a man who is processing something through his body while his mind catches up. The footsteps reached the left side of the shelter, continued around the front, the open front where we lay on the platform, with our sleeping bags and our vulnerability, the sound passing across the clearing in front of us at the same 20-yard distance, the footsteps visible in sound but not in sight, the clearing dark enough that the tree line was a wall of black, and the space between the trees held nothing my eyes could resolve into a shape. The footsteps continued to the right side of the shelter, around the back, returning to the point where I'd first heard them. And they continued, around again. The same path, the same pace, the same 20-yard distance, the footsteps completing a second circuit of the shelter with the same steady, unhurried rhythm as the first. Left side, front, right side, back. 3 minutes, approximately, from start to start, the circuit timed by the pace and the circumference of the path. Danny was awake now. All 4 of us on the platform, rigid in our sleeping bags, listening to something walk around us in the dark. Nobody spoke. The silence among us was unanimous and instinctive. The same decision made by 4 people independently, the decision to not announce our wakefulness, to lie still and listen, and not attract the attention of whatever was circling our shelter on 2 legs in the middle of the night. The third circuit, same path, same pace, same distance. The footsteps falling on the leaf litter, with the particular regularity of something that was not investigating and not searching, and not doing any of the things that would explain why a bipedal organism would walk in circles around a shelter at 1 in the morning. The circling had the quality of function rather than curiosity, the purposeful repetition of a behavior that served a goal that I couldn't determine, the mechanical patience of something performing a task. Bears don't circle shelters. I need to note this because it's the explanation that the rational mind reaches for, and that the rational mind has to release. Bears approach and investigate, and sometimes enter, and sometimes leave. Their behavior driven by the food-seeking imperative that governs most bear-human encounters on the AT. Bears don't walk in 20-yard circles around shelters for hours. Coyotes don't do it. Deer don't do it. No animal in the Appalachian forest performs sustained, circular, bipedal locomotion around a fixed point for hours. The circuits continued. 4, 5, 6. I stopped counting after 10 because the counting was becoming its own kind of torment. The numbers accumulating without providing information, each circuit identical to the last, the footsteps tracing the same path at the same pace, with a consistency that said this was not going to stop, that whatever was circling us was going to continue circling for as long as its purpose required. I whispered to Beck. I turned my head and spoke into the space between our sleeping bags, with a volume that was barely above thought. "Do you hear that?" She turned her head. She said yes. Her voice was flat and controlled, and conveyed more information in that single syllable than a paragraph would have. The yes of a person who has been lying awake for an hour, listening to something walk circles around them, and who has been waiting for someone else to confirm that the experience is shared. Gordon spoke from my other side. He said it's been going since about 1. Danny said nothing. Danny was 22, and on his first long hike, and the particular quality of his silence, said that he was processing this experience without the frameworks that the rest of us were applying, the rationalizations and the explanations and the comparative analysis that older and more experienced people use to contain the things that don't fit inside their categories. The circling continued. We lay on the platform and we listened, and we didn't get up, and we didn't shine our headlamps into the forest, and we didn't shout or make noise or do any of the things that hikers are taught to do when they encounter wildlife at shelters. We didn't do those things because what was circling us wasn't wildlife, and we knew it wasn't wildlife, and doing the things you do for wildlife felt inadequate for whatever was out there, the way bringing a kitchen knife to a situation that requires something else entirely feels inadequate, the tool wrong for the task. 4 hours. The circling continued for 4 hours, from approximately 1 a.m. until approximately 5, the footsteps maintaining their circuit with the unflagging regularity of something that didn't tire and didn't vary and didn't lose interest. The pace never changed. The distance never changed. The sound of the footsteps on the leaf litter was the same at 4:30 as it had been at 1:15. The rhythm unbroken, the circuit repeating with the mechanical persistence of something that would continue until whatever signal told it to stop. It stopped at dawn, not at sunrise, because the shelter was in a hollow where the sun wouldn't be visible for another hour, but at the first lightening of the sky, the barely perceptible shift from black to dark gray that announces the approach of day before the day itself arrives. The footsteps completed a circuit and did not begin another one. The forest held its silence for a moment, the particular silence that follows the cessation of a sustained sound, and then the birds started, and the insects resumed, and the normal sounds of morning replaced the 4 hours of circling with the acoustic texture of a day beginning. We got up, all 4 of us, out of the sleeping bags, boots on, headlamps on, although the light was growing, the lamps providing the additional illumination that we needed to see the ground around the shelter clearly. We walked to the tree line. We walked the perimeter of the clearing, following the path that the footsteps had described all night. The path was visible. In the leaf litter that covered the forest floor, at a consistent distance of 20 yards from the shelter walls, a trail had been worn. Not a faint impression, not a subtle compression that you'd miss if you weren't looking. A path. A visible, compressed, clearly defined ring of disturbed leaves that circled the shelter completely, the leaves pushed aside and compacted by the repeated passage of something that had walked the same route for 4 hours. The path as clear and as intentional as a walking trail, worn into a lawn by someone who walks the same route every day. We looked for footprints. The leaves were compressed, but the compression showed no detail, no print, no shape that could be attributed to a foot of any kind. The path showed only the volume of the disturbance, the width of the compressed area, which was approximately 18 inches, suggesting a stride that placed one foot in front of the other in a line rather than the side-by-side placement that would produce a wider path. We didn't stay for breakfast. We packed and hiked out with the focused efficiency of 4 people who had agreed without discussion that this campsite was not a place where we wanted to spend any more time. We hiked north at a pace that was faster than our usual pace, and we didn't talk about it until lunch, when we sat on a rock beside the trail and ate and looked at each other, and began the conversation that would continue for the remaining months of our hike, and that has continued since, the shared attempt to explain what circled our shelter for 4 hours, and left a visible path in the leaves, and produced bipedal footsteps that 4 experienced hikers heard clearly, and that no animal we know makes. Gordon said patrol. He said the word quietly, with the careful pronunciation of a man testing a theory. He said whatever circled us was patrolling, walking a perimeter, maintaining a boundary around the shelter, the way a sentry walks a perimeter around a position. Not investigating, not hunting, patrolling. The word fit. The regularity of the circuit, the consistency of the distance, the mechanical repetition that continued for 4 hours without variation, all of it corresponded to the behavior of something performing a function, maintaining a presence around a fixed point, walking a boundary that it had established, and that it was enforcing with its presence and its patience. The question that the word raised was worse than the question it answered. If something was patrolling around our shelter, the question was not what was circling us, but what it was keeping out. What exists in that section of the Nantahala forest that requires a perimeter? What comes to shelters at night that something else walks circles to prevent? We finished the trail. We reached Katahdin in September, and on the nights when I lie in bed and listen to the sounds of my house and the neighborhood and the domesticated world that I live in now, I think about the shelter in the Nantahala, and the 4 hours of circling, and the compressed ring of leaves that something wore into the forest floor, while we lay on the platform and listened. And I think about Gordon's word, patrol. And I think about what was outside the circle that the patrol was maintaining. And I think about whether the thing circling us was keeping something out or keeping us in. And I don't know which answer is worse. The White Mountains of New Hampshire are not the whites that the tourism brochures sell. The brochures show the summit views and the autumn color and the rustic charm of the hut system, the AMC lodges perched on the ridgelines where hikers pay for a bunk and a hot meal, and the particular experience of sleeping above treeline in weather that can kill you. That's the public whites, the version that generates revenue and that populates Instagram with photographs of people standing on exposed granite with the clouds below them. The backcountry whites, the terrain between the summits, the ravines and the drainages and the dense spruce forest that covers the slopes below treeline, that's a different landscape. That's the landscape that produces the weather that kills the unprepared hikers and that holds the terrain that breaks the ankles of the prepared ones, and that contains the particular quality of wilderness that New England produces. When the elevation is high enough and the terrain is steep enough and the forest is dense enough to create an interior that feels more like the backcountry of Alaska than the backcountry of a state that you can drive across in 3 hours. I was section hiking the AT through the Presidential Range in September of 2022, a week-long trip that took me from Pinkham Notch over the northern Presidentials and south, through the range to Crawford Notch, approximately 30 miles of trail that crosses some of the most exposed and most demanding terrain on the entire Appalachian Trail. The weather cooperates in September more often than it doesn't, the summer's instability giving way to the stable, high-pressure systems that September produces in New England, the days clear and cool, the nights cold, the conditions favorable for the ridge walking that the Presidentials demand. I was hiking alone. My name is David, and I'm telling you my name because my name is the center of what happened, and because referring to it obliquely would diminish the particular violation that hearing it produced. David, the name my parents gave me, the name that my wife uses, the name that my colleagues know me by, the name that appears on my driver's license and my passport and the documents that constitute my legal identity. Not my trail name, which was Ridgeline, and which was the name I used in shelter registers and in trail conversations and on the gear tag attached to my pack. David was nowhere on the trail. Not written on any register, not spoken to any hiker I'd met, not visible on any piece of equipment I carried. David existed only inside me, the private name that the trail didn't know. The section where it happened was below treeline, in the transition zone between the exposed ridgeline and the valley floor, where the trail descended from the alpine environment of the summits into the dense spruce and hardwood forest that filled the ravines and the drainages on the mountain's flanks. The trail was steep, switchbacking down a slope that dropped maybe 2,000 feet from the ridge to a creek crossing in the valley below, the terrain forested and close, the spruce giving way to hardwood as the elevation decreased, the canopy thickening until the sky was visible only in fragments between the leaves. The ravine was to my left as I descended, a steep, forested drainage that fell away from the trail's edge into a narrow valley where a stream ran, the water audible but not visible through the dense vegetation that covered the slope. The ravine was deep, the far side visible as a wall of dark spruce maybe 200 yards across the void, the bottom of the drainage hidden by the canopy, and the terrain's angle. The slope between the trail and the bottom was steep enough to require hands if you were climbing it, and dangerous enough to injure you if you were descending it carelessly, the kind of terrain that the trail avoids and that the forest occupies without any accommodation for human traffic. I heard my name at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The day was clear, the September light filtering through the canopy with the particular golden quality that September produces in New England, the air cool and still. I was moving at a moderate pace down the switchbacks, my trekking poles clicking on the rocks, my breathing elevated from the descent, the normal sounds of a hiker working through steep terrain. David, from the ravine, from below the trail, from a position that I estimated at approximately 100 yards down the slope, in the forest, in the drainage that I couldn't see the bottom of. My name, spoken once, clearly, with a conversational tone that contained no urgency, no distress, no quality that suggested the speaker was in trouble or was trying to attract attention. The tone was familiar, the particular way a person says your name when they've encountered you unexpectedly and are pleased, the casual, warm delivery of a name spoken by someone who knows you. The voice was female, not a specific woman I could identify, not my wife's voice or my mother's voice or any voice I recognized, but a female voice, the register and the timbre of a woman speaking normally, the sound carrying up the slope from the ravine with a clarity that the September air and the terrain's acoustics provided, the valley below acting as an amplifier that sent the sound upward with more projection than a voice at that distance would normally achieve. I stopped. The trail was silent except for the stream below and the rustle of a slight breeze in the canopy. I stood on the switchback and looked down the slope into the ravine and saw only forest, the dense tangle of hardwood and spruce that covered the drainage. The trees packed closely enough that visibility below the canopy was maybe 30 feet before the green closed in and the interior became impenetrable. David. Again, same voice, same direction, same distance, same conversational tone. My name spoken by a woman in a ravine 100 yards below the trail on a section of the AT, where I was hiking alone and where nobody knew my name and where the terrain between the trail and the voice was steep enough and dense enough that no person would be standing in it casually and calling up to the trail. I didn't respond. The decision was automatic, produced by an instinct that operated faster than the rational assessment that followed it, the body deciding before the mind that responding to a voice that knew your name when it shouldn't was not something the body was going to permit. I stood on the trail and I listened, and my mouth stayed closed and my voice stayed in my chest, and the instinct that held it there was older than language and more certain than any thought I could have assembled. The voice called 3 more times. David, 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 spaced approximately 30 seconds apart, each call identical in tone and volume and clarity, the name spoken with the patient repetition of someone who is calling and who expects an answer and who will keep calling until the answer comes. The voice maintained its female quality, the warmth and the familiarity undimmed by the lack of response, as if my silence was not discouraging whatever was calling, but was simply a delay in a conversation that it was confident would eventually begin. After the 5th call, the voice stopped. The ravine was quiet, the stream audible, the September afternoon continuing without the voice, the forest holding its normal sounds, the particular absence of the calling creating a silence that was heavier than the silence that had preceded it, the acoustic space where the voice had been now empty and conspicuous. I hiked on, faster than I'd been moving, the pace driven by something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite urgency, but that was closer to both than I was comfortable acknowledging. The switchbacks continued, the trail descending toward the creek, crossing in the valley bottom, the ravine to my left deepening as the trail dropped, the slope between me and whatever had been calling my name steepening with each turn. I reached the shelter in the late afternoon, a standard AT shelter on a flat area beside the creek, the structure showing 3 hikers already in residence, 2 men and a woman who were unpacking their gear and settling in for the night. I dropped my pack and I sat on the shelter's edge and I breathed and I thought about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. I described the voice, carefully, without mentioning the name. I said I'd heard a voice calling from the ravine on the descent, a voice that seemed to be addressing me specifically, a voice that called multiple times and then stopped. I described the location, the section of trail, the approximate position of the voice in the drainage below, I asked if anyone had heard anything similar. The woman went still. Her name was Kate, a section hiker from Vermont, and the stillness that settled over her was the particular immobility of a person who has just heard something that confirms an experience they've been carrying alone. She set down the stuff sack she'd been holding and she looked at me and she said she'd heard it. She'd hiked the same section the previous day, same trail, same descent, same ravine. She said a voice had called from the drainage below the trail, from the same approximate position that I described, calling at the same intervals with the same patient repetition. She said the voice had called her name, her given name, Kate, not her trail name, which was Maple, and which was the name she used in every register and every trail interaction. Kate, spoken from the ravine by a voice that knew the name she hadn't told anyone on the trail. The voice that called her was male. She described it as calm, conversational, warm, the tone of someone who knew her and who was happy to see her, a man's voice speaking her name from a drainage that was steep and forested and that contained no visible source for the sound. We compared details. The same ravine, the same approximate position on the slope, the same distance from the trail, the same conversational tone, the same patient repetition, the same cessation after multiple calls when no response was given. The only difference was the voice itself, female for me and male for her, the gender of the caller matching whatever would be most disarming, most familiar, most likely to produce a response from the hiker, hearing their name called from below the trail. The two men at the shelter listened to our exchange with the increasingly uncomfortable attention of people who are hearing something that they don't want to integrate into their understanding of the trail they're hiking. One of them had passed through the same section that morning. He said he hadn't heard a voice. He said he'd felt something, an unease on the descent through that section of switchbacks, that he'd attributed to the terrain and the steepness, and the particular isolation of the ravine's edge. He said he'd walked faster through that section without knowing why. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the shelter and listened to the creek and thought about the voice in the ravine and the name it had used, and the question that the experience reduced to, which was how. Not what or why, but how. How did something in a ravine in the White Mountains know my name, the name that existed nowhere on the trail, the name that I carried inside me as privately as I carried my heartbeat, the name that was mine and that nothing on this trail should have had access to? I don't have an answer. Kate doesn't have an answer. The ravine holds whatever it holds, and the trail descends through the switchbacks above it, and the hikers who pass through that section hear what they hear, or don't hear it, and the voice, if it calls, uses the name that should be unknowable, spoken with a warmth that is almost welcoming, almost friendly, almost safe. Almost. That word does the work. Almost safe. The way a lure is almost food. Almost welcoming. The way a trap is almost shelter. Almost friendly. The way something that wants you to come closer always sounds friendly, until you're close enough that friendly doesn't matter anymore. It called my name. From a ravine that was too steep to walk into casually and too dense to see into clearly and too deep to climb out of easily. It called my name with the voice of a woman, warm and calm and patient. And it waited for me to respond, to call back, to begin the conversation that would give it a direction and a distance, and the particular information that a voice provides when it answers from above, the information that says here I am and how far I am and exactly where on the trail I'm standing. I didn't answer. Kate didn't answer. The instinct that held our voices in our chests was the same instinct, the ancient recognition that some calls are not invitations but extractions, the voice that knows your name, working to draw you toward the voice's source, down the slope, into the ravine, into the drainage where the terrain is steep and the forest is dense and the trail above is far enough away that no one on it would hear you. The ravine is still there. The trail still descends through the switchbacks above it, and something in the drainage still knows the names that hikers carry privately, the names that aren't written anywhere on the trail, the names that belong to the people who pass above, and that the voice uses with a familiarity that should be impossible. And that is, for that reason, the most disturbing thing about it. It knows your name, the one you didn't tell anyone, the one you carry silently. And it calls it from the ravine, patient and warm, waiting for the hiker who answers. Roan Mountain sits on the Tennessee-North Carolina border, at an elevation where the Appalachian Trail crosses terrain that looks nothing like the forested ridgelines that characterize most of the trail's southern sections. Above 5,000 feet, the forest gives way to the balds. The open grassy summits that have been treeless for as long as anyone has recorded, the high meadows that ecologists have been arguing about for decades because nobody can definitively explain why they exist. The theories range from fire to grazing, to climate to soil chemistry. But the balds persist without explanation, the grass growing thick and green above the tree line on mountains, where the tree line should be higher than it is, the summits open and windswept, and offering the kind of 360-degree views that hikers travel hundreds of miles to see. The AT through the Rhone Highlands is one of the most popular sections of the trail in the southern Appalachians, the combination of accessible trailheads and spectacular scenery, drawing day hikers and section hikers and through hikers in numbers that make the trail feel crowded in summer, and that, even in June, when the rhododendron is blooming and the balds are at their greenest, produce a steady stream of foot traffic that wears the trail into a clearly defined path through the grass, the beaten surface visible as a brown strip against the green of the bald, the route as obvious and as easy to follow as a sidewalk through a park. I was day hiking on a Saturday in June of 2023, a straightforward out and back from Carver's Gap, the trailhead that provides the easiest access to the Rhone balds, and that on a June Saturday was packed with cars, the parking area full, the overflow extending down the road, the trailhead humming with the particular energy of a popular hiking destination on a beautiful day. I started around 10 in the morning, hiking south on the AT, climbing through the transition from the Gap's spruce forest to the open grassland of Round Bald, the first of the series of balds that the trail crosses in this section. The hiking was easy. The trail was clear, the path through the grass worn to bare earth by the traffic of thousands of feet, the white blazes painted on rocks at intervals that were frequent enough to be almost unnecessary, because the trail was so obvious that navigation required no marks at all, the brown strip of beaten path visible for hundreds of yards across the open grass. The route as clear as a road. I passed other hikers in both directions, the Saturday traffic steady, families with children and couples with dogs and solo hikers with poles and packs, the diverse population of a popular AT section on a summer day. I hiked about 4 miles, crossing Round Bald and Jane Bald and reaching the high point of Grassy Ridge Bald, where the elevation tops 6,000 feet and the view extends in every direction, the Blue Ridge to the south, the Tennessee Valley to the west, the ridgeline continuing north toward the next series of peaks. I found a spot just off the trail, a flat area of grass beside a large rock that bore a white blaze, the rectangular paint mark that identifies the AT's route, and I sat down and ate my lunch and took photographs and rested with the satisfied fatigue of someone who has hiked 4 miles uphill and who will turn around and hike 4 miles downhill, and who is, for the moment, exactly where they want to be. I sat for maybe 30 minutes. The day was clear, the June sun warm at elevation, the wind light, the grass around me showing the particular green of early summer on the balds, the color deep and uniform, the grass thick and even, the surface of the bald extending in every direction like a carpet laid over the mountain's summit. Other hikers passed on the trail while I sat, their voices carrying across the open ground, the sounds of a Saturday on a popular bald, laughter and conversation and the particular social energy of people sharing a beautiful place. I packed my lunch, put on my pack, and stood up and turned around to hike back the way I'd come. The trail was gone. I need to describe what gone means, because the word alone doesn't capture the particular quality of absence that I encountered when I turned around on that bald. The trail, the beaten path of bare earth that I'd been walking on for 4 miles, the strip of brown that was visible across the grass for hundreds of yards in either direction, the path that was so clear and so obvious that navigation required no attention at all, was not there. The grass of the bald extended in every direction without interruption, without any indication that a path had ever crossed it. The surface continuous and uniform and unbroken, the particular evenness of mountain grass that has not been walked on or disturbed, every blade standing at the same height, the same color, the same texture. I looked at the rock beside me, the rock where the white blaze had been painted, the mark I'd been sitting next to for 30 minutes. The rock was there, the blaze was not. The surface of the rock showed only natural stone, gray and lichen covered, showing no trace of white paint, no rectangular mark, no indication that anyone had ever painted anything on its surface. I turned in a slow circle. The bald extended around me in every direction, the grass unbroken, the terrain showing the gentle undulations of the mountain summit without any feature that corresponded to a trail. No beaten path, no blazes on the scattered rocks, no signposts, no cairns, no markers of any kind. The bald was a continuous surface of grass, as if the Appalachian Trail had never crossed it, as if the path that I'd walked and that hundreds of other hikers had walked that day had been erased or had never existed. The hikers were gone too. The Saturday traffic that had been steady all morning, the families and the couples and the solo hikers passing in both directions, was absent. The bald was empty. I was standing alone on a 6,000-foot summit that had been populated with people 30 minutes earlier and that now held only grass and wind and the particular silence of a high, open place that is unoccupied. I felt the disorientation first as a physical sensation, a vertigo that started in the inner ear and radiated outward, the body responding to a spatial environment that had changed fundamentally without any sensory explanation for the change. I'd been sitting on a trail beside a blazed rock on a populated bald, and I'd stood up and turned around, and the trail and the blaze and the people were gone, replaced by an unbroken surface of grass that showed no evidence that any of them had ever been present. I walked to where the trail should have been. North of where I'd been sitting, the trail should have been visible as a beaten path descending the bald toward Jane Bald, the brown strip of packed earth clearly visible against the green grass, the route I'd walked 2 hours earlier. I walked to the approximate location and stood on grass that was thick and even and undisturbed, grass that showed no compression, no wear, no evidence of foot traffic. I knelt and looked at the ground. The grass was growing normally, the blades upright and healthy, not bent or broken or compressed by the thousands of feet that should have crossed this surface on this Saturday in June. The soil beneath the grass was soft and dark and showed no compaction, the particular undisturbed quality of earth that has been growing grass for a long time and that has not been walked on. I stood up and turned slowly, scanning the entire bald. The tree line was visible in every direction, the dark edge of the spruce forest that bordered the open grassland, the boundary between bald and forest that defined the limits of the summit. The trees looked the same as they had all morning. The sky looked the same. The wind felt the same. Everything about the environment was consistent with the Saturday morning I'd been hiking in, except that the trail was gone, and the hikers were gone, and the blazes were gone, and I was standing alone on a surface that had never been a trail. I walked in circles for maybe 5 minutes, expanding my search, looking for any trace of the path that should have been there. Nothing. The grass was continuous in every direction, the bald showing the particular uniformity of a surface that had not been disturbed. The absence of the trail not a matter of concealment or overgrowth, but of non-existence, the trail simply not being there in the way that a road is not in a field. The absence fundamental rather than temporary. I checked my phone. The time was correct. The date was correct. The GPS showed my position on the bald at the coordinates where I expected to be. The mapping app showed the AT crossing the bald at the location where I was standing. The digital world confirmed that the trail existed. The physical world showed me grass. I sat down on the rock that should have had a blaze on it and didn't. I sat there and I looked at the empty bald and I breathed and I tried to apply logic to a situation that logic could not accommodate. I had walked here on a trail. The trail was not here. These two facts could not coexist, and yet they did. The memory of the trail and the absence of the trail occupying the same moment, the before and the after, separated by nothing more than the act of standing up and turning around. 30 minutes. I sat on that rock for approximately 30 minutes, the time measured by my phone, the minutes passing with the particular slowness of time experienced in a state of sustained disorientation, each minute containing more attention and more awareness than minutes normally contain, the brain running at a heightened processing speed that made the passage of time feel elongated. During those 30 minutes, the bald was silent. No wind, which had been present all morning. No insects, which had been buzzing in the grass since I'd started hiking. No birds, which had been circling the thermals above the bald throughout the day. The silence was complete, and it was wrong. The particular wrongness of a natural environment that has been stripped of its normal acoustic content, the absence of sound indicating not quietness but vacancy, a landscape that was not merely quiet but that was holding nothing that could produce sound. And then I turned around one more time, the particular turn that I cannot explain and that I've replayed in my memory hundreds of times since, The rotation of my body from facing north to facing south and then continuing, turning past south toward the west and the north again, a full rotation, 360 degrees, and when I came back around to facing north, the trail was there. The beaten path, the brown strip of packed earth through the green grass, the white blaze on the rock beside me, the rectangular mark of white paint that I'd been sitting next to when I ate my lunch. The trail visible for hundreds of yards across the Bald, descending toward Jane Bald, the route clear and obvious and exactly where it had been when I arrived. And the hikers, a couple coming up the trail toward me, maybe 200 yards away, walking with poles, their conversation audible in the distance. A family further behind them with children running ahead. The Saturday traffic resumed as if it had never stopped. The populated Bald restored, the trail and the blazes, and the people returned to the summit that had been empty for 30 minutes. I hiked out without stopping. 4 miles of descent, the trail solid beneath my feet, the blazes appearing on rocks at regular intervals, the path as clear and as certain as it had been on the way up, the route performing its function without any indication that it had ceased to exist for half an hour on the summit of Grassy Ridge Bald. I've been back, many times, in every season. The trail is always there. The blazes are always painted. The Balds show the beaten path of thousands of feet with the particular permanence of a trail that has been walked for decades, and that shows no sign of going anywhere. But I sat on that Bald for 30 minutes in a world where the trail didn't exist, where the grass was unbroken and the blazes were absent, and the hikers were gone and the silence was complete, and the mountain surface showed no evidence that a trail had ever crossed it. 30 minutes in a version of the Bald that existed before the trail, or that exists alongside the trail, or that exists in the moments when the trail decides, for reasons that trails don't have and mountains don't explain, to not be there. The trail came back. It was there when I turned around. But the 30 minutes when it wasn't are the 30 minutes that I carry. The half hour on a Bald in the Roan Highlands, when the mountain showed me what it looked like before we put a path across it. And the mountain didn't need me to leave. It just needed me to see that the trail is temporary, that the grass is permanent, and that the mountain, when it chooses, can show you the difference. My hiking partner Ben and I have been doing an annual trip on the Appalachian Trail for 8 years, a week in the fall, always Virginia, because Virginia contains the most AT miles of any state, and because the terrain is varied enough that we can hike a different section every year and still have sections left to explore. We're not through hikers, we're section hikers who treat the AT the way some people treat a restaurant menu, sampling different portions at a pace that allows appreciation rather than endurance. The weekly trips accumulating over 8 years into a respectable total of Virginia miles that we track not with the goal of completion, but with the satisfaction of people who enjoy the process more than the destination. October of 2022. We were hiking a section of the trail in the George Washington National Forest, the stretch that crosses the ridges west of the Shenandoah Valley, terrain that is steep and forested, and that in October produces the particular color that Virginia hardwoods are famous for, the oaks turning bronze, and the maples turning red, and the hickories turning gold against the dark green of the hemlock that persists in the drainages. The trail in this section runs along ridge lines and through hollows, crossing creeks and climbing grades with the constant undulation that the Virginia AT is known for. The terrain never flat for long, the trail rising and falling with the rhythm that thru hikers call the Virginia blues, because the repeated climbs wear you down with a persistence that flatter terrain doesn't produce. The campsite was a designated site about 7 miles from the trailhead where we'd started, a flat area beside a creek that the trail crossed on a footbridge, the site showing the standard features of an AT campsite in the National Forest: a cleared flat area, a fire ring built from creek stones, a bear pole for hanging food, space for 2 or 3 tents on the packed earth that generations of hikers had compressed into a surface that was almost as hard as pavement. The creek ran beside the site with the constant murmur that mountain creeks maintain, the water clear and cold, the sound providing the acoustic backdrop that every creekside campsite offers, the particular white noise of moving water that is simultaneously calming and isolating, the sound covering other sounds, masking the nighttime noises that the forest produces and that you hear more clearly at campsites that are further from water. We set up around 5, 2 tents, positioned on the flat area with the fire ring between them, the arrangement that 8 years of camping together had made automatic, each of us knowing where to pitch and how to orient and where the other's tent would be, the spatial grammar of a shared campsite that didn't require discussion. Ben collected firewood while I hung the bear bag, and by 6 we had a fire going in the ring, the stones containing the flame, the wood crackling with the particular sound of dry hardwood burning well, the fire producing the heat and the light that make a campsite feel like a home, and that make the surrounding darkness feel like a wall, the lit circle of the camp isolated in the forested darkness like a room without walls. We cooked dinner over the fire and over our camp stove and ate and drank coffee and sat in our chairs and talked and watched the fire burn down the way campfires burn down, the active flames giving way to the glowing collapse of logs that have been consumed to the point where they fall into themselves, the coals pulsing orange and red with the residual combustion that continues after the flames have died. By 9, the fire was a bed of coals, the heat still significant, the glow visible, but the active burning finished. The fire in the state that experienced campers leave it in when they go to bed, hot enough to warm the immediate area but not producing flame, the coals that would gray over during the night and that would be cold ash by morning. We turned in. The October night was cold enough to want the sleeping bag zipped fully and warm enough to sleep comfortably in a 3-season bag with a good pad. The creek provided its constant sound. The forest held its October quiet, the insects reduced by the cold, the nighttime activity minimal, the particular stillness of the Appalachian forest in October, when the summer's biological intensity has waned and the winter's silence hasn't yet arrived. I woke at approximately 2 in the morning, not from sound, not from any stimulus I could identify as an auditory trigger. I woke because there was light, orange, flickering, dancing on the nylon walls of my tent with the unmistakable quality of firelight, the moving shadows, and the warm glow that only an active fire produces, the light entering my tent through the fabric and illuminating the interior with the particular dance of flame. I lay still and looked at the tent wall. The light was real, not the faint glow of coals that hadn't fully died, which would have produced a dim, steady, non-flickering illumination. This was flame light, active, dynamic, the brightness and the movement pattern of a fire that was burning with established flame, logs producing combustion, the fire in a state that required fuel, and that had fuel and that was consuming it. I unzipped the tent, slowly, the zipper loud in the night, the sound cutting through the creak noise and the fire crackle that I could now hear, the pop and snap of burning wood, the particular voice of a campfire that is burning well. I opened the tent fly and looked at the fire ring. The fire was burning, not the coals we'd left, a fire. Logs in the ring, 3 or 4 pieces of wood arranged in the teepee configuration that produces the best flame, the wood burning with established combustion, the flames maybe 18 inches high, the fire producing the light and the heat and the sound of a campfire that has been built by someone who knows how to build a campfire and that has been burning long enough to develop a bed of coals beneath the fresh wood, the particular state of a fire that has been tended, that someone has built and fed and brought to the stage where the combustion is self-sustaining. The wood was not ours. I recognized this immediately because I'd collected the wood we'd burned that evening and I knew what it looked like. The deadfall branches and the broken limbs of the hardwood forest around the campsite, the particular diameter and the particular bark of the oak and the hickory that I'd gathered. The wood in the fire ring was different, larger pieces, split rather than broken, the fresh faces of the wood showing the pale interior of recently split timber, the kind of wood that someone had prepared with an axe or a hatchet, the pieces uniform in size and cut to fire ring length, with the deliberate preparation of someone who was building a fire to last. No one was at the fire. The campsite was empty. The light from the fire illuminated the area around the ring, maybe 15 feet in every direction, showing the packed earth and the bare pole and the creek bridge and the edges of our tents and nothing else. No person, no pack, no gear, no evidence that anyone was present at the campsite except Ben and me in our tents, and the fire that someone had built on our coals with wood that someone had brought. I looked at Ben's tent. The mesh panel on his tent door showed the interior in the firelight, and Ben was awake, lying in his bag, his head lifted, watching the fire through the mesh with the same focused attention that I was watching it through my open tent fly. He saw me looking at him. We made eye contact across the campsite, the fire between us, and he shook his head once, the minimal gesture of a man communicating that he had not gotten up and built a fire, and that he had no explanation for what we were both looking at. We didn't get up. This is the part that people question when I tell this story. The "why didn't you investigate" response that assumes the rational course of action was to leave the tent and walk to the fire and examine the wood and search the surrounding forest for whoever had built it. We didn't do that. We lay in our tents, maybe 20 feet from a fire that someone had built in our camp at 2 in the morning, and we watched it through the mesh and the nylon, and we did not get up because the same instinct that woke us was now instructing us to stay in our tents. The ancient calculation of threat assessment, concluding that the tent, thin as it was, represented a boundary that should not be crossed, that whatever had built the fire had not disturbed our tents and had not approached us, and that maintaining the separation was more important than satisfying the curiosity. The fire burned for approximately 2 hours. I watched it for the entire duration, the flames consuming the split wood with the steady progression of a well-built fire, the logs collapsing into coals, the flame height diminishing gradually as the fuel was consumed, the fire dying the way all fires die, the combustion slowing as the wood was exhausted, the flames giving way to coals, and the coals giving way to gray ash, and the light fading from the campsite in a gradient that returned the darkness by degrees, until the tent walls showed only the faint glow of residual heat, and then nothing. The campsite was dark again by approximately 4. The fire had consumed its fuel and died, and the night returned to its pre-fire state, the creek audible, the October darkness complete, the campsite holding only the residual warmth of a fire that had burned for 2 hours, with no one to tend it and no one to sit beside it, and no purpose that I could determine beyond the act of burning itself. Dawn came. I got up with the first light and walked to the fire ring and looked at what it held. Ash. The gray-white residue of completely consumed wood, the ash deeper than what our evening fire had produced, the additional volume consistent with the logs that had been burning at 2 a.m. Among the ash, the remains of the split wood, the charred ends of pieces that had been too thick to burn completely, showing the clean faces of wood that had been split with a blade rather than broken by hand. Our wood pile was undisturbed. The deadfall we'd collected sat beside the fire ring where we'd stacked it, the pieces showing the bark and the diameter that I recognized from the previous evening's collection. None of it had been burned. The wood in the fire ring was not our wood, and our wood had not been used. Ben emerged from his tent. He walked to the fire ring and looked at the ash and the charred remains. And then he looked at me and said, "Did that happen?" And I said yes. And we stood on either side of a fire ring that held the evidence of a fire we hadn't built, that had been built by someone or something that had arrived at our campsite at 2 in the morning with split wood and the knowledge of how to build a fire, and that had built one and sat with it, or hadn't sat with it, and that had been invisible to 2 people watching from 20 feet away. We packed up and hiked out that morning. We didn't discuss it on the trail, the way you don't discuss things that your mind is still processing, the experience sitting between us as a shared weight that was too new to carry in conversation. We talked about it later, by phone, the way distance makes discussion easier, the miles between us providing enough separation from the campsite that the words could come. Ben said the fire was real. He'd felt the heat through his tent. He'd watched the flames for 2 hours. He'd seen the wood, the split pieces, the prepared fuel that neither of us had brought. Real fire, real wood, real heat, real ash in the morning, but no one at the fire. That's the detail that the experience reduces to when you strip away the analysis and the explanation attempts and the what-ifs. A fire burning in a campsite at 2 in the morning with no one sitting at it, built by hands that we couldn't see with wood, that we hadn't brought on coals that we'd left. Someone used our fire ring, someone who needed a fire at 2 a.m., and who brought their own wood, and who built it on our coals, and who sat in our campsite, or stood in it, or existed in it in whatever way they exist, and who was not visible to 2 people watching from their tents 20 feet away. We still hike Virginia. We still camp at designated sites. We still build fires in fire rings and let them burn to coals and go to bed. But some mornings, the ash in the ring is deeper than it should be. The coals more completely consumed than an evening fire would produce. The residue of additional fuel that burned in the hours when we were sleeping or when we were watching and seeing nothing. And the fire ring holds what it holds. The ash of fires we built and the ash of fires we didn't. The evidence of warmth sought by something that needs fire and that finds it in the rings that hikers leave. And I wonder who sits at the fire when the hikers are in their tents, who warms their hands at the flames, who carries split wood through the forest at 2 in the morning and builds a fire in a ring beside a creek where 2 men lie awake in their tents, watching the light dance on the nylon and seeing no one. The fire is real, the ash is real, and whoever sits at it is real enough to need warmth and skilled enough to build a fire, and invisible enough that 2 people watching from 20 feet away can see the fire, but not the one who built it. I hike the Shenandoah section of the AT more than any other, because it's close to where I live in Charlottesville, and because the park provides an experience that balances wilderness with accessibility in a way that suits my particular approach to hiking, which is to go alone, go light, and go often. The short trips that a 2-hour drive makes possible, and that a life organized around outdoor time makes frequent. I've hiked every mile of the AT through Shenandoah, the 101 miles from Rockfish Gap to Front Royal, in every season and every weather. The trail as familiar to me as the streets of my own neighborhood, the shelters and the overlooks and the stream crossings committed to a mental map that operates below conscious navigation, my feet knowing the trail before my mind tells them where to go. November is my favorite month in Shenandoah. The crowds are gone, the leaves are down, the forest opens up to sightlines that summer's canopy blocks, and the park settles into the particular quiet that late autumn produces, the stillness of a landscape that is preparing for winter, the biological activity of the forest slowing to the baseline metabolism that will sustain it through the cold months. The trail in November is empty most of the time, especially on weekdays, the through hikers having passed through months earlier, and the recreational traffic reduced to the occasional day hiker and the rare section hiker who, like me, prefers the empty trail to the populated one. Wednesday, November 9th, 2022. I entered the trail from a fire road about 30 miles south of Front Royal, planning an overnight trip to a shelter about 8 miles in, a shelter I'd stayed at dozens of times, and that I knew the way you know a second home, the dimensions and the orientation, and the particular creaks of the sleeping platform memorized by repetition. The hiking was good, the November forest bare and open, the trail surface covered with newly fallen leaves that made the walking soft, and that muffled the sound of my boots to a whisper. The temperature was in the 40s, the sky overcast with the high, thin clouds that November produces when the weather is stable, the light flat and even and colorless, the particular quality of November light that photographers call dull, and that I find beautiful in its honesty. The forest shone without the flattery of golden hour, the trees and the terrain as they actually are, gray and brown, and stripped to their essential forms. I reached the shelter around 4 in the afternoon, the light already beginning the early fade that November produces, when the sun is low and the days are short, and the hollow where the shelter sat blocked the direct light from the west. The shelter was one of the standard Shenandoah designs, a 3-sided stone structure with a sleeping platform, an overhanging roof, and an open front that faced a clearing with a fire ring and a picnic table, and the privy trail that led into the forest. The shelter was full. 8 people were in and around the structure, some sitting on the sleeping platform with their legs hanging over the edge, some sitting on the ground near the fire ring, where a fire was burning with the steady flame of a well-established fire that had been burning for hours. They were arranged in the particular configuration of a group that has been at a campsite long enough to have settled into positions, each person occupying their space with the comfort of someone who has been there for a while and who isn't planning to move. My first response was surprise. Not alarm, not unease, just the surprise of arriving at a shelter that I expected to be empty and finding it occupied by more people than most November shelters see in a week. I adjusted my expectations the way hikers do, the mild disappointment of not having the shelter to myself, giving way to the social acceptance that shared shelters require, the AT etiquette of accommodation that says the shelter belongs to whoever arrives, and that everyone makes room. I called out as I approached, "Hey," the standard trail greeting, the word that says I'm here, I'm friendly, I'm one of you. The greeting that initiates the social exchange that every shelter encounter begins with. The where are you from and how far today, and where are you headed, that constitutes the basic vocabulary of trail conversation. No response. The 8 people in and around the shelter showed no reaction to my greeting. No heads turned, no hands waved. No voices returned the hello that trail etiquette required, and that I had never, in years of hiking, failed to receive from fellow hikers at a shelter. The 8 people continued doing what they'd been doing, which was sitting in their positions in complete silence, the particular quality of their stillness registering for the first time as something other than rest. I walked closer. The details became available in the way that details become available as distance decreases, the resolution increasing with each step, the shapes resolving into specifics. They were dressed in hiking clothing, not modern hiking clothing, not the synthetic fabrics and the bright colors and the brand logos that current outdoor gear displays. The clothing was plain, earth-toned, functional in a way that suggested durability rather than performance. The heavy cotton and the wool and the leather that an earlier generation of hikers wore, the materials that predated the synthetic revolution that transformed outdoor gear in the 1990s. The clothing looked used but maintained, the particular condition of gear that is worn regularly and cared for properly, the seams intact, the fabric clean, the overall appearance of equipment that is someone's only equipment and that they treat accordingly. Their gear was similarly plain, packs that were external frame, the aluminum and canvas design that was standard before internal frame packs took over, the packs leaning against the shelter wall in a row, each one showing the particular loading and organization of a pack that its owner knows well. Boots, leather, heavy, the kind of boots that hikers wore before trail runners became the standard footwear, the boots sitting in pairs beside the platform where their owners had removed them. The fire was burning in the ring with the steady flame of a fire built by someone who understood fire. The logs arranged properly, the coals deep, the fire in the self-sustaining state that an experienced fire builder achieves when they've been tending a fire for hours. The smoke rose straight in the still November air, the column visible against the gray sky, the smell of burning hardwood filling the clearing with the particular warmth that wood smoke adds to cold air. I set down my pack at the edge of the platform. I greeted them again, louder, more specifically. "Hey guys, getting cold out there." The particular cheerfulness that you deploy when your first greeting has failed, and when you're trying to bridge the awkwardness of unreciprocated sociability. Nothing. 8 people, none of them looking at me, none of them acknowledging my presence, none of them producing any sound or gesture or facial expression that indicated awareness that a 9th person had arrived at the shelter and was standing among them and was speaking to them. The silence was not hostile. I need to be clear about this, because hostility has a quality, a tension, a directed energy that you feel as a pressure, and this silence had none of that. It was simply empty, the non-response of things that were present in the way that the shelter and the trees and the fire ring were present, occupying space, existing in the clearing, showing no capacity for the social interaction that human presence normally generates. I examined their faces, not staring, not the focused scrutiny that would be rude if they were people who could perceive rudeness. Looking, the way you look at something you're trying to understand, the eyes collecting information that the brain is working to categorize. The faces were human. Normal features, normal proportions, the particular variety that a group of 8 random hikers would display, different ages and different genders and different expressions that were not expressions at all, but the neutral default of faces that were not being used for communication. The eyes were the wrong part, not wrong in their appearance, which was normal. Wrong in their focus, which was nowhere. The eyes of all 8 people were open and directed forward and focused on nothing. The particular unfocused gaze of someone who is not looking at anything, the eyes functional but unoccupied, receiving light without processing it into attention. I set up anyway. The next shelter was 6 miles further, and the November dark was coming fast, and the prospect of hiking 6 miles with a headlamp through a forest that was producing an experience I couldn't classify was worse than the prospect of sleeping in a shelter with 8 silent, unresponsive occupants. I spread my pad and my bag on the platform, maintaining a distance from the nearest silent figure that was more than I would normally maintain in a shared shelter. The space between us, a physical expression of the social space that the 8 people had made clear, was not going to be bridged. I cooked my dinner on my stove. I ate it sitting on the platform. The 8 people sat in their positions and did not eat. No food was visible among their gear. No stove, no pot, no cup. The fire burned in the ring and nobody warmed their hands at it, and nobody fed it wood, but the flames continued with the steady combustion of a fire that should have needed tending, and that didn't get it, and that burned anyway. I went to sleep around 8. The shelter was cold, the November air settling into the open-fronted structure, with the particular chill that stone shelters produce, the walls absorbing the day's minimal heat and radiating it outward. I zipped my bag and I looked at the platform beside me, where 3 of the 8 people were sitting, their legs still hanging over the edge, their posture unchanged from 4 hours earlier, the particular immobility of something that does not need to shift or adjust or move because the discomforts that cause movement are not discomforts that apply. I woke at 3 in the morning. The shelter was empty, not gradually emptied, not cleared by people who had packed up and moved on while I slept. Empty in the way that a room is empty when you turn on the light and nothing is there. The space unoccupied, the platform bare except for my gear, the clearing outside, showing the fire ring and the picnic table, and the privy trail, and nothing else. No packs against the wall, no boots beside the platform, no people sitting in the positions they'd occupied for hours. The fire ring was cold, not the warm coals of a fire that had been burning 6 hours ago, cold. The ash in the ring was gray and compressed and old, the residue of fires that had burned weeks earlier and that had been rained on and dried and rained on again, the particular aged ash that accumulates in fire rings between uses when nobody is building fires. No fresh ash, no recent coals, no evidence that a fire had burned in this ring tonight or in the recent past. I checked the shelter in the clearing with my headlamp. The platform showed my sleeping pad and my bag and no other compression. No marks where bodies had been sitting for hours. The surface showing only the dust and the leaf debris of a platform that one person has used rather than 9. The ground around the fire ring showed my boot prints from the evening and no others. The trail in both directions showed the undisturbed leaves that November deposits on the tread and that record every boot print with the particular clarity that wet leaves provide. No prints except mine. No gear, no fire, no evidence of 8 people. I packed up in the dark and hiked out by headlamp and reached my car at the fire road as the November dawn was graying the sky to the east. I sat in the car with the engine running and the heater on, and I went through the experience in my mind with the systematic attention of someone who needs to determine whether what they experienced was real. 8 people in the shelter. I'd seen them. I'd spoken to them. I'd examined their faces and their clothing and their gear and the fire they'd been sitting around. I'd set up my sleeping bag within feet of 3 of them. I'd eaten dinner while they sat in their silence. And at 3 a.m. the shelter was empty, and the fire ring was cold, and the platform showed no marks, and the trail showed no prints, and November in Shenandoah had produced an experience that I can file under nothing in my understanding of what the trail holds and what shelters contain, and what 8 people do when they arrive at a backcountry shelter and sit in silence, and don't eat and don't speak, and don't respond and disappear between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. without leaving a single trace that they were ever there. The shelter is still there. I've been back. The shelter is empty every time, the normal empty of a November shelter on a weekday, the platform bare, the fire ring holding old ash, the clearing quiet. And I set up, and I cook dinner, and I go to sleep. But I check the shelter before I arrive now, not just the approach, not just the standard awareness of what's ahead on the trail. I check. I look through the trees as I approach, looking for people, looking for gear, looking for fire, and the shelter is always empty. Except it wasn't. Once, on a Wednesday in November, it was full. 8 people sitting in silence with clothing from another era and gear from another decade, and a fire that was burning in a ring that the morning showed as cold. And the question is not whether they were real. I sat among them, I spoke to them, I slept beside them. They were as real as the shelter and the platform and the fire. The question is where they went, and when, and whether the shelter is really empty on the nights I arrive and find nobody there, or whether it's always full and I'm simply arriving at the times when whatever fills it has decided not to be seen. The 100-mile wilderness is the AT's final exam for northbound through hikers. The last stretch before Katahdin, 100 miles of trail through the Maine backcountry that crosses no paved road and passes no town, and offers no easy exit from the moment you walk in at Monson to the moment you walk out at a bowl bridge with Katahdin visible ahead and the end of the trail a day's hike away. I was hiking it in September of 2023, not as a through hiker, but as a section hiker, taking on the 100-mile as a standalone trip, 10 days of backcountry travel through terrain that is as remote as anything the eastern United States offers, the Maine woods extending in every direction without boundary, the forest dense and dark and continuous, the particular wilderness that Maine produces, when the terrain is far enough from roads and towns that the land reverts to the state it occupied before humans decided it needed improving. I'd been planning the trip for a year. The 100-mile requires preparation that other AT sections don't. The logistics of carrying 10 days of food, the fitness to maintain the daily mileage that the resupply gap demands, the particular mental readiness that extended isolation requires, the willingness to be alone in the woods for longer than most people are comfortable being alone anywhere. I'd trained for the physical demands, and I'd assembled the gear, and I'd studied the trail guide with the particular attention of someone who knows that in the 100-mile, the margin for error is thinner than anywhere else on the AT, because the consequences of error are amplified by the distance from help. The terrain was what Maine delivers, which is a trail that is simultaneously beautiful and punishing. The path winding through spruce and hardwood forest across terrain that undulates relentlessly, the trail climbing over ridges and descending to pond shores, and crossing drainages on log bridges and root networks that the Maine forest produces in place of the maintained tread that other states provide. The forest was dense in the way that the Maine backcountry is dense, the understory thick with ferns and hobblebush, and the low evergreen growth that fills the spaces between the trunks, the canopy overhead blocking most of the sky, the trail existing as a narrow corridor through vegetation that would be impenetrable without the path. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked my planned mileage, made camp at the designated sites, ate my calculated portions, filtered water from the streams that crossed the trail at regular intervals. The forest produced its normal sounds, the chickadees and the nuthatches and the occasional raven, the chipmunks in the leaf litter, the distant percussion of a woodpecker working a dead snag. September in Maine is the transition between the green density of summer and the opening that autumn brings, the hardwoods just beginning to turn, the nights cold enough for frost, the days warm enough for comfortable hiking, the season balanced between what was and what's coming. The third day was when I noticed it. Around noon, maybe 2 hours into the day's hike, on a section of trail that ran relatively straight through a stand of mixed spruce and hardwood, the forest dense on both sides, the undergrowth thick, the visibility into the forest limited to maybe 50 yards before the vegetation closed in, and the interior became a wall of green and brown that showed nothing beyond itself. The sound was to my left. Not a specific sound, not a footstep or a snap, or any of the discrete auditory events that the forest produces when an animal moves through it. A continuous, low-level disturbance in the vegetation, the particular sound that dense undergrowth makes when something moves through it, with enough mass to displace the ferns and the branches that occupy the space between the trees, but with enough control, enough familiarity with the vegetation, to move without breaking anything. The sound was a sustained whisper, the soft, ongoing rustle of vegetation being pushed aside and springing back, the acoustic signature of a body moving through the forest at a pace that kept it parallel to me, and at a distance that I estimated at about 50 yards. I registered it initially as a moose. The 100-mile is moose country, the big animals common in the Maine backcountry, their movement through dense forest producing exactly the kind of sustained vegetation displacement that I was hearing. A moose parallel to the trail at 50 yards was not unusual and was not concerning. The animals large but generally not aggressive toward hikers, their passage through the forest a regular feature of the acoustic environment. But the sound didn't behave like a moose. A moose moves through the forest on its own trajectory, following its own route for its own reasons, the direction and the speed independent of any human trail activity. A moose might parallel the trail briefly by coincidence, but it wouldn't maintain a precise distance for an extended period because moose don't navigate relative to human trails. They navigate relative to the terrain and the food and the water and the cover that their own biology requires. Whatever was to my left was navigating relative to me. The distance was consistent, not the gradually changing distance that would result from two entities traveling on independent paths that happened to be roughly parallel. Consistent, the sound maintaining its volume and its directionality, with a steadiness that said the source was maintaining its position at 50 yards, the way a vehicle maintains its position in an adjacent lane, deliberately, continuously, with ongoing adjustment to match my speed and my direction. I walked faster. The sound accelerated, the whisper of displaced vegetation increasing in tempo, the rate of branch deflection and release quickening to match my increased pace. I slowed to a near stop. The sound slowed, the sustained whisper diminishing to almost nothing, the displacement minimal, the source barely moving, matching my near stop with a corresponding near stop of its own. I stopped completely, stood still on the trail, my poles planted, my breathing the only sound I was producing. The forest to my left went quiet, not gradually quiet, not the diminishing sound of something that was slowing to a stop. Quiet, the vegetation whisper ceasing the moment I ceased moving, the synchronization between my movement and the sound's existence, confirmed by the precision of the simultaneous stop. I stood for maybe 2 minutes. The forest to my left held its silence. The normal sounds of the backcountry continued, the birds and the insects in the distant water, but from the direction where the sound had been, nothing. The particular nothing of a space that is occupied by something that has stopped moving and that is waiting. I resumed. The sound resumed. Immediately, without the brief delay that would indicate something hearing me move, and then starting its own movement in response. Simultaneously, my first step and the first whisper of vegetation displacement occurring in the same moment, the source beginning its movement at the instant I began mine, the coordination too precise for reactive matching, and more consistent with something that was connected to my movement at a level that didn't require the lag time of hearing and responding. This continued for 6 miles. 3 hours of hiking through the Maine backcountry with something moving through the forest 50 yards to my left, keeping pace, maintaining distance, adjusting its direction when the trail curved, the sound tracking my progress with the dedicated attention of something that was following me, not approaching, not retreating, just following, maintaining the parallel course that said, I know where you are and I'm going where you're going, and I'm not coming closer but I'm not leaving. I stopped for water at a creek crossing around the 3-hour mark. The sound stopped when I stopped, the vegetation to my left going silent with the same instantaneous synchronization that every stop had produced. I sat on a rock beside the creek and filtered water and ate a bar, and I looked into the forest to my left and I saw nothing. The undergrowth was thick, the ferns waist-high, the hobblebush and the young spruce filling the spaces between the mature trees with the particular density that the Maine forest maintains in areas where the canopy is thick enough to suppress growth, but not thick enough to eliminate it. 50 yards into that vegetation, something was standing still and silent and waiting for me to resume. I couldn't see it. 50 yards of dense Maine undergrowth might as well be a wall. The vegetation absorbed visibility the way fog absorbs it, the sight lines terminating within a few yards, the interior of the forest showing only the layered green and brown of interlocking branches and ferns, and the particular impenetrability of backcountry that has never been cleared or managed or made accessible for human navigation. I resumed hiking. The sound resumed. The trail descended to a creek crossing at the 6-mile mark, dropping from the forested ridge into a rocky drainage where the creek ran over exposed granite. The terrain on my left transitioning from the dense forest that had held the sound for 3 hours to a rocky, open drainage where the vegetation thinned to scattered bushes on the granite. The sound stopped. At the point where the forest ended and the drainage began, the vegetation displacement ceased, the sustained whisper cutting off as if the source had reached a boundary it wouldn't cross, the edge of the forest serving as the limit of whatever was following me, the dense undergrowth that had concealed its passage, giving way to open terrain that would not conceal it, and that it therefore would not enter. I crossed the creek on stepping stones and climbed the far bank and entered the forest on the other side and listened. Nothing. The forest to my left was quiet, the normal quiet of the Maine backcountry, the birds and the insects and the absence of the vegetation whisper that had accompanied me for 6 miles. Whatever had been there had not crossed the drainage, had stopped at the edge of the rock in the open ground, and had let me walk away across terrain that it wouldn't follow me through. I hiked the remaining 7 days of the 100-mile wilderness without hearing the sound again. 7 days of trail through the same type of forest, the same dense understory, the same terrain that should have been equally suitable for whatever had paralleled me for 6 miles on the 3rd day. The forest to my left was quiet. The forest to my right was quiet. The trail held only my footsteps and the normal sounds of the backcountry and the absence of the sustained whisper that I listened for at every step. I've told a few people, hikers who've done the 100-mile, people who know the Maine backcountry, People who understand the particular quality of isolation that the 100 Mile provides, and who can appreciate the difference between hearing a moose in the forest and hearing something that keeps pace with you for 3 hours across 6 miles of trail with a precision that no moose exhibits. 2 of them nodded. 2 out of maybe a dozen I've told. Both of them had experienced something similar in the 100 Mile, something in the forest paralleling their movement, maintaining distance, tracking their progress with the particular awareness that the sound communicated, the knowledge of your position and your speed, and the commitment to matching both for miles of sustained parallel travel. Neither of them saw it. The main backcountry is too dense to see 50 yards into the forest, the vegetation maintaining the visual barrier that conceals whatever moves within it. You hear it and you measure it and you calculate its distance and its pace, and you build a profile of something that is large enough to displace vegetation and controlled enough to avoid breaking it, and that follows your movement with a precision that suggests intelligence and patience, and an interest in your passage that goes beyond the curiosity of any animal you know. Something walks the 100 Mile. In the forest beside the trail, maintaining distance, keeping pace, following the hikers who pass through the most remote section of the Appalachian Trail, with the particular attention of something that lives in these woods and that monitors what enters them. I heard it for 6 miles, 3 hours. And then it stopped at a drainage it wouldn't cross, at a boundary between the dense forest that concealed it and the open terrain that wouldn't, and it let me go. And the forest closed behind me. And the drainage separated us. And I walked on through the 100 Mile wilderness, listening for the whisper of something moving through the ferns at 50 yards that didn't come again, and that I have never stopped listening for, and that the main backcountry holds in its dense, dark, impenetrable interior. Patient, parallel, present, walking when I walk, stopping when I stop, 50 yards away, in the green, in the quiet, and the ferns close behind it, and I never see it, and it never comes closer, but it's there. I keep records. This is important for understanding what follows, because the records are the foundation of the experience, and the records are what made the discovery possible, and the records are what I return to when I need to confirm that what happened was real and not a product of the particular madness that 12 years of obsessive section hiking might produce in a person who has organized a significant portion of their life around a 2,100-mile trail and the meticulous documentation of their progress along it. I started section hiking the Appalachian Trail in 2011, the year I turned 30, beginning with a week-long trip through the Shenandoah section that I chose because it was close to where I lived in Richmond and because it was considered one of the easier sections of the trail, a reasonable starting point for someone whose hiking experience was limited to day trips and who was stepping up to multi-day backcountry travel for the first time. That trip covered about 60 miles, and it infected me with the particular obsession that the AT produces in certain people, the desire to walk the entire thing, to complete the connection between Springer Mountain and Katahdin, to stand at both endpoints, and know that your feet touched every mile of trail between them. Life doesn't allow 5 months. Not my life, with a career and a mortgage, and the accumulated obligations that define the existence of a person in their 30s and 40s, who wants to walk across the eastern seaboard, but who also wants to maintain a job and a home and the relationships that both of those things require. So I section hike. A week here, 10 days there, the miles accumulating over years, the completed sections coloring in on the map that I keep on my office wall, the gaps between the colored sections narrowing each year as I fill in the pieces that remain. The records are part of the obsession. I track every mile against the AT data book, the annually updated publication that catalogs every feature on the trail with the precision of a surveyor's log, every shelter listed with its distance from the preceding shelter and the next, every road crossing and water source and viewpoint and campsite documented with GPS coordinates and mileage that allows a hiker to know exactly where they are on the trail at any given point. My personal log mirrors the data book's format, each day's hike recorded with starting and ending mileages, the features passed, the time spent, the conditions encountered, the meticulous documentation of a person who finds satisfaction in the precision of records and who uses that precision as a framework for an experience that might otherwise feel formless. October of 2023, I was hiking a section of the AT in central Virginia, the stretch between Daleville and the James River, approximately 50 miles of trail that crosses the Blue Ridge through terrain that is characteristic of the Virginia AT, the constant rising and falling that the ridgeline produces, the trail climbing to viewpoints and descending to gaps, and climbing again with the repetitive rhythm that makes Virginia the longest state on the AT, and that makes its miles feel longer than its miles. I was on the third day of a 5-day trip, hiking a section of ridge trail through hardwood forest that was showing the first tentative color of October, the maples beginning to turn while the oaks held their green, the forest in the transitional state that early October produces when the season hasn't committed yet, and the canopy holds both summer and autumn in an undecided mix. The trail was well maintained and well blazed, the white rectangular marks appearing on trees at the intervals that the AT standards specify, the blazes serving the navigational purpose that they've served since the trail's earliest days. The marks that say you're on the trail, you're going the right way, keep walking. I passed a mile marker. Not a blaze, not the standard rectangular white mark that indicates the trail's route, but a marker, a white blaze painted on a rock beside the trail, with a number painted below it in the same white paint. Mile markers on the AT are not standard. The trail doesn't use numbered markers the way a highway does. The distance is tracked instead by the data book and the individual hiker's navigation, rather than by marks on the trail itself. Some sections have informal markers, placed by trail clubs, or by individual maintainers who paint mileage numbers on rocks, or posts for the convenience of hikers, but these are unofficial and inconsistent, and they correspond to the mileage system that the data book documents. The number on this marker did not correspond. I checked it against the data book. I was at approximately mile 872 based on my tracking, a position that the data book confirmed with the shelter I'd passed that morning and the road crossing that was 2 miles ahead. The marker showed a different number, a number that was between the mile designations that the data book listed for my current position, a number that should not have existed because the sequential numbering system that the data book uses accounts for every mile, and the number on the rock was an addition, an insertion, a mile that existed between 2 miles that were already accounted for. I stood beside the rock and I looked at the number and I checked my data book and I checked my GPS and I confirmed my position and I confirmed that the number on the rock did not match any mile designation in the current edition of the data book. I pulled out my phone and checked the previous year's edition, which I kept as a digital file. The number wasn't there either. I checked the edition before that. Not there. The number on the rock designated a mile of the Appalachian Trail that had never appeared in any edition of the data book that I could access. I photographed it, multiple angles, close-up of the number, wide shots showing the rock's position relative to the trail, the detail photographs that a person takes when they found something anomalous, and when they want to document it with enough precision to prove it later. The paint was white, the same shade and the same texture as the standard AT blazes, the application showing the same brush width and the same technique that trail maintainers use when they refresh the blazes during their scheduled maintenance trips. The number was painted with care, the digits formed clearly, the paint applied with the deliberate attention of someone who was marking a specific location with a specific designation. The rock itself was unremarkable, a sandstone boulder beside the trail, maybe 2 feet high and 3 feet across, the kind of rock that the Virginia mountains produce in abundance, and that trail maintainers use as surfaces for blazes when trees aren't available. The rock showed lichen on its unmarked surfaces and the particular weathering of stone that has been exposed to mountain conditions for a long time. The painted surfaces, the blaze and the number, were clean and fresh, the paint showing no weathering, no fading, no deterioration, the application recent enough that the paint still had the slight sheen that fresh exterior paint maintains before exposure to UV and moisture dulls it. I marked the GPS coordinates. I recorded the number in my log. I photographed the surrounding trail in both directions, documenting the position of the marker relative to the legitimate blazes that preceded and followed it on the trail. The legitimate blazes were normal, the standard white rectangles on trees at standard intervals, the blazes consistent with every other section of maintained AT I'd hiked in 12 years. The marker on the rock was the only anomaly, the additional blaze with its impossible number existing between the legitimate blazes like a word inserted into a sentence that changes the sentence's meaning. I hiked on. The trail continued normally. The next legitimate blaze appeared at the expected interval. the white rectangle on a tree confirming the trail's route and my position on it. The road crossing came at the mileage the data book specified. The shelter that evening was where it should have been. Everything about the trail matched the data book's documentation except for the marker on the rock, the mile that shouldn't have existed and that the data book said didn't exist, but that the photograph on my phone and the coordinates in my GPS showed was there, painted in white on a sandstone boulder beside the AT in Central Virginia. I researched it when I got home. I contacted the local trail club that maintained the section where I'd found the marker. They had no record of painting a mile marker at those coordinates. They maintained the blazes on a regular schedule, and they did not paint numbers below the blazes, and they had no knowledge of anyone who did. I contacted the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. They confirmed that mile markers with numbers are not part of the AT's standard blaze protocol, and that the number I described did not correspond to any designation in their mapping system. I returned the following spring, April of 2024, hiking back to the coordinates I'd marked, the GPS guiding me to the specific point on the trail where the rock had been. The rock was there, the same sandstone boulder, the same position beside the trail, the same lichen-covered surface. The blaze was gone. The number was gone. The rock showed only natural stone. The surface where the white paint had been showing no trace of paint, no residue, no shadow of pigment, no indication that anything had ever been applied to the stone. The rock looked as if it had never been painted, the surface showing the uniform weathering of stone that has been exposed to the elements without interruption. I knelt beside the rock and examined it closely. I ran my fingers over the surface where the paint had been. Dry, rough, natural stone. No paint chip fragments, no faded remnant. No physical evidence of the marker that my photographs showed clearly, and that my GPS confirmed I was in the correct location to find. I checked my photographs. They were there, clear, detailed, showing the white blaze and the number on the rock, the paint fresh, the digits legible. The photographs existed, the GPS coordinates existed, the entry in my log existed. The marker did not exist. A mile of the Appalachian Trail that appeared on a rock in October and was gone by April. A number that designated a mile that no data book has ever listed. A blaze painted in the standard style with the standard paint by someone or something that was not the trail club and not the conservancy and not any person who has been identified. I think about that mile. The mile that the number designated, the stretch of trail that exists between two documented miles and that the data book says isn't there. I hiked through it. I walked the section of trail where the marker sat, and I didn't notice anything unusual about the terrain or the forest or the experience of walking through it. The mile passing under my feet the way every mile passes, one step at a time. The trail doing what the trail does. But the marker said that mile had a number. The marker said that stretch of trail was designated, was cataloged, was marked by someone who considered it significant enough to paint a blaze and a number on a rock, and to apply the paint with the same care and the same materials that the official trail system uses. A mile that exists only in my photographs and my GPS log. A marker that was there in October and gone in April. A number that no edition of the data book has ever contained. The trail is 2,100 miles long. Every mile is documented. Every mile has a number. Every feature is cataloged in the data book with the precision that 80 years of trail maintenance has produced. And for 1 October, the trail had an extra mile. A mile that someone marked and that someone removed. A mile that existed between two documented miles, the way a room exists between two rooms in a house that you thought you knew completely, and that turns out to contain a space you've never seen. I have the photographs. I have the coordinates. I have the number that designates a mile of trail that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy says has never existed. And the rock sits beside the trail in Central Virginia, unmarked, showing only natural stone, waiting for whatever painted it in October to paint it again. And the mile is there, between the documented miles, the mile that the trail holds but that the data book doesn't list. And I walked through it, and I didn't know it was different. And I wonder what's different about it, what the number means, what the marker designates, what happens in the mile of trail that the data book says isn't there but that the paint on a rock said was. The photographs show a number, the rock shows nothing. And somewhere between those two facts, a mile of trail exists that the official documentation denies, and that the mountain holds, and that the paint, when it appears, marks for what